If we had met before, what you're seeing is an oil painting, the kind that deserves time and a good place on your screen. You can stay with it alone, use it as ambience, as decoration, as quiet company. Or you can stay for the story I'm about to tell you. The experience is completely yours. Chapter 1, The First Flight, 2007, 18 years old. A note from the narrator. There are things no one sees because no one was looking at the right moment. I was. I have watched these two people for much longer than they have watched each other. I know the exact weight of silence between two strangers. I know what it costs. Every second. Every almost. Every door that closed one breath too soon. What I will tell you happened. What could have happened, too. That is the difference between them and me. They only remember what occurred. I carry everything else. The darkness in Moko is not the same darkness as in the cities. In cities, darkness is residual and complete, punctured by amber streetlights and glowing screens and the chronic luminescence of millions of people who simply refuse to fully sleep. In Moko, darkness is ancient and honest. It smells of damp earth and a nearby river. It has the texture of wet leaves and the temperature of a jungle breathing. It has been exactly what it is for centuries, without aspiring to anything else. Valentina Ruiz had spent 18 years sleeping inside that darkness, though on that particular morning, January 15th, 2007, she was not sleeping. She had been lying still in her bed for 2 hours, staring at the ceiling she had memorized before she learned to read. The cracks in the plaster formed a map that only she knew. That diagonal line was the Moko River. That brown stain was the mountain range. And that small white spot in the corner was, if you wanted it to be, Bogota. She had always wanted it to be Bogota. At 5:15, the neighbor's rooster crowed. She had heard it her whole life without paying it any attention, but that morning the sound landed on her with a precision that hurt, as if the animal somehow knew it was the last time Valentina would hear it from this bed, from this room, from this version of herself that would end in a matter of hours on the asphalt of an airport that still existed only in her imagination, not yet in her body. She sat up slowly. The room was full of her. Books on the floor because the shelves had overflowed 2 years ago. Notebooks stacked with a discipline that compensated for every other kind of disorder. A photograph of Frida Kahlo taped above the mirror because at 14 she had decided that if anyone understood what it meant to carry something you never asked for, it was Frida. On the floor beside the bed sat a closed suitcase, medium-sized, dark green. They had bought it the previous Saturday at a store downtown, and her mother had insisted on a blue one because green is bad luck. Valentina, for God's sake. But Valentina had chosen the green precisely for that reason, because the decision was hers and the color was hers, and the luck, good or bad, was hers too. The suitcase held 4 changes of clothes, 2 pairs of shoes, 8 books she had promised herself only 4, but the other 4 had packed themselves. She would swear to it, a brand new notebook she hadn't opened yet, because she had decided that its first page would be written in Bogota, that words begun somewhere else would be a different kind of words entirely. Also, a jar of hand cream her grandmother had pressed into her hands while saying that the Bogota cold cracks your knuckles, and a letter from her mother that she'd been asked not to open until she arrived. She wasn't going to wait, but she would try. The kitchen smelled of hot chocolate and cassava bread. Gloria Ruiz had been awake since 4 because she had stopped pretending to sleep at 2, and she had stopped pretending at 2 because she had reached the limit of what pretending could accomplish. She was 51 years old, had lived her entire life in Putumayo, had never boarded an airplane, and her only daughter was leaving on one in 4 hours. She made the hot chocolate twice. The first time she let it burn without noticing, because she was standing at the window staring out at the dark garden, thinking about the orange trees she had planted the day Valentina was born, how it was now the height of a grown person, and wondering whether that meant something or whether it was simply a tree that grew, because trees grow. The second time she made it well, with cinnamon and without distraction, and served it in the large mug, the one with yellow flowers that had been Valentina's favorite since she was small. When Valentina came downstairs with her hair in a hasty braid, and her eyes still fogged with sleeplessness. She found her mother standing with her back to the kitchen, pretending to organize something that was already organized. "Mom, the hot chocolate is ready. Sit down." "Mom, you don't have to." "Sit down, Valentina." She sat. There are conversations that happen without words, built entirely from turned backs and cups placed on tables with too much care and silences that weigh more than any sentence. That morning in the Ruiz kitchen was one of those conversations. Gloria set the cassava bread on a plate. Valentina picked it up. The hot chocolate steamed. Outside, the rooster crowed again. "Do you have everything?" Gloria asked, still not turning around. "Yes. Your ID?" "Yes. The address of the residence hall?" "Yes, Mom." "Mrs. Esperanza's number?" "Yes." "The number of the... I have all the numbers, Mom?" Gloria turned around. Her eyes held that particular brightness of someone who has spent hours resisting tears and has reached the edge without quite crossing it, that impossible and heroic equilibrium that mothers maintain when they decide their pain must not weigh more than their child's joy. "Good," she said simply. Valentina stood and hugged her. Gloria received her with both arms, and for 30 seconds that neither of them counted, they stayed like that, mother and daughter in a kitchen that smelled of hot chocolate in early morning, while outside, Putumayo went on being Putumayo. Humid, alive, indifferent, and beautiful. Uncle Roberto arrived at 6 in his beat-up pickup truck, honking twice out of habit even though they were already waiting for him. Valentina loaded the green suitcase with deliberate focus, paying close attention to the physical details. The weight, the grip, the soft thud of the tailgate closing, so she wouldn't have to pay attention to what she felt, which was something too large and too mixed to have a single name. It was fear. It was also euphoria. It was also that specific sadness of leaving something you love not because you love it any less, but because you have grown larger than the space that contains you, and growing hurts even when it is exactly what you wanted. It was the imposter syndrome arriving early. What if I'm not enough for Bogota? What if Bogota flattens me before I can do anything with it? It was her mother's voice telling her always yes, that she could, that the most stubborn and most capable Ruiz in all of Putumayo was not going to break on the first test. The truck pulled away. Valentina watched from the rear window as Moco receded into a darkness that was just beginning to crack with the first gray light of dawn. The church. The plaza, Mr. Hector's shop where she had bought her first notebook. The bridge over the river. The orange tree in the garden, which could no longer be seen but which she saw anyway. Then the road and the jungle closing in on both sides like an embrace or a goodbye, which are sometimes the same thing. 3 days earlier, and 500 miles north, Santiago Mora was staring at the ceiling of a hotel room in Cartagena when his father knocked on the door and asked whether he was going to come down for dinner or spend another night being useless in silence. Useless in silence was Rodrigo Mora's phrase for any emotional state of his sons that could not be converted into dinner table conversation. Santiago had spent 16 years learning his father's vocabulary, and at 18 he understood it with the cold clarity of someone who has translated a language they never chose to learn. "I'll be down in 10 minutes, he said. His father closed the door. Santiago went back to staring at the ceiling. The family trip to Cartagena had been his mother's idea. Lusa organized something she called the reunion trip every January with a renewed and admirable faith, considering that the last 4 had ended with Rodrigo drinking more than he should, Santiago escaping to whatever beach he could find with his headphones on, and Lucia pretending that the family in the vacation photographs was the same family that existed the rest of the year. It wasn't. What the photographs contained was a Sunday version of the Moras, Rodrigo in an unbuttoned shirt, wearing a smile he produced for cameras with the same naturalness with which a man puts on a tie, Lucia with her hair up and the eyes of someone who has decided to be happy as an act of sheer will, and Santiago at the center or off to one side, taller than both of them since he was 15, with an expression that looked like calm in photos, and in reality was the face one makes after learning to be invisible within one's own last name. He liked silence, though. He had liked it since childhood, when he discovered that in silence things have shape, that if you stay still long enough you begin to see the structure of spaces. The lines that hold up ceilings, the reason a window is placed where it is and not 2 feet to the left. At 12, he had announced he wanted to be an architect. His father said that takes money. His mother said how wonderful. Neither of them asked why. The why was simple. Santiago wanted to build spaces where people could be well, spaces that didn't lie. That looked the same on the inside as they did on the outside, which was, if he thought about it, exactly the opposite of his family. Dinner was cordial in the specific way that families are cordial, when they have resigned themselves to cordiality as the only available currency. Rodrigo talked about a business deal. Lucia talked about a friend. Santiago ate. At some point between the main course and dessert, his father said, "Next year you'll be in college." Yes, architecture. Yes, that's a long program. 5 years, and then what? Santiago looked at him. Then what? After the 5 years? After the degree? After this dinner? After this family? Then I build things, he said. Rodrigo nodded with the expression of someone accepting an answer without being convinced by the question. Lucia looked at both of them with her Sunday smile. That night, Santiago went out to the boardwalk alone. It was his last night in Cartagena. He sat on a low wall facing the sea and stayed there for a while doing nothing, which was what he did best when no one was watching, simply being somewhere, letting the place occupy him rather than the other way around. The Caribbean at night has a sound unlike any other. The waves are not violent but persistent, like someone knocking on a door without urgency because they know it will eventually open. Santiago listened to that sound for an hour and thought about college, about Bogota, about the blueprints he would draw, about being 18 with the future, still a blank space he could design however he chose. He also thought, in that vague, shapeless way one thinks about such things at 18, sitting before a nighttime sea, that he would like to find someone. Not necessarily a love story, just someone. A person whose silence was the same kind as his, not the uncomfortable silence of a family dinner, but the shared silence that is, in truth, the most honest form of company. He didn't know that person existed. He didn't know that at that very moment, while he stared at the Caribbean, she was in Putumayo staring at her bedroom ceiling, memorizing the cracks in the plaster for the last time. I knew, and I kept that to myself, as I always do, patient and still, the way only someone who has never needed sleep can afford to be. The plane connecting Moco to Bogota was small. 16 seats, 2 propeller engines, oval windows just large enough to press your face against. Valentina sat in row 3, window seat, and they took off in the first light of morning, when the sky above Putumayo is that impossible combination of pink and green that looks painted by someone unafraid of color. She watched Moco shrink below zinc rooftops, the river, the trees, and pressed her teeth together and did not cry, which was what she had decided. The city kept shrinking until a cloud swallowed it, and there was nothing left to see but white. She opened 100 Years of Solitude. She had read it 3 times, but she decided that reading it again on the plane was a good omen, that beginning her university life with Macondo was a statement of intent. That if Garcia Marquez had built an entire universe from the Colombian coast, she could build hers from Putumayo. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. She read the first line 4 times before it landed. Her mind was doing too many things at once to process literature with the attention literature deserves. She closed the book, opened it again, looked out the window. A perfectly flat plain of white clouds stretched as far as she could see, smooth enough to walk on. Valentina thought that was exactly what hope felt like when it was young. An even surface, no cracks that you believed could hold your weight. At 18, she didn't yet know that clouds hold nothing. At 18, that doesn't matter. Bogota's El Dorado Airport in January of 2007 was a permanent work in progress. Some corridor always cordoned off, some makeshift sign, some employee pointing right with the same authority he might have pointed left. It was loud, enormous, and smelled of vending machine coffee and new plastic, and the accumulated weight of thousands of people carrying their entire worlds in bags of different sizes. Valentina stepped off the plane and felt Bogota's cold for the first time in her life. It wasn't the clean cold of high mountain air. It was Bogota cold, democratic and relentless, the kind that works its way under your clothes with the patience of something that knows it has all the time in the world, not aggressive, permeating. A cold that says, "Welcome and please bring a heavier jacket next time." Valentina hadn't brought a heavy enough jacket. She had known this while packing and had ignored it anyway. Because 18 has a particular relationship with consequences, it sees them, weighs them, and ignores them regardless. She adjusted her backpack and followed the current of passengers with her eyes open wider than usual. The high ceilings, the departure boards blinking green, the corridors splitting into other corridors, people moving with the velocity of those who know exactly where they're going. She had arrived. She was in Bogota. She smiled to herself. Not quite happiness, something more complex than that. The recognition of having crossed a threshold with no way back. That simultaneously terrifying and magnificent feeling of having done what she set out to do. She collected the green suitcase, found the connections area, and read that her next flight departed in 4 hours and 40 minutes. An eternity to inhabit. She found the waiting area. She sat. The flight from Cartagena to Bogota lasted an hour and 40 minutes, during which Rodrigo slept, Lucia read a magazine, and Santiago drew in the last page of his sketchbook the facade of an imaginary, building with no specific purpose, but a proportion that felt right. He had been drawing structures since he was 10 lines in volumes, the relationship between them, the way a space is defined by its edges. His art teacher in high school had once told him his drawings lacked emotion. Santiago replied, with the politeness of someone well brought up and the certainty of someone who knows they're right, that emotion in architecture lived not in the line but in the space the line defined. The teacher didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure either then or now whether it had been a brilliant answer or an elaborate way of not feeling anything. The plane landed. Santiago looked out at Bogota's overcast January sky, always threatening rain. Never quite committed to it, and thought that in 2 weeks he would start college, architecture at the National University. 5 years. The beginning of his real life, not this provisional one of family reunion trips and dinner table silences. While waiting for his parents with the luggage, he walked the airport the way he always moved through spaces, not as a passenger, but as a reader, studying what a room was trying to say. It was large, functional, with the brutal honesty of places built for transit. Nothing here invites you to stay because everything is built for movement. The seats exactly uncomfortable enough to remind you that your destination is somewhere else. The lights white and without nuance because ambiguity in lighting is a luxury airports cannot afford. Santiago liked nuance. He liked detours. He had always been drawn to things that refused to be efficient. "I'm going to find something to eat," he said when his parents appeared. "The VIP lounge has..." "By myself," he said, in the tone that wasn't rudeness but declaration, the one his parents had learned, after 18 years, to leave alone. He walked without direction for 10 minutes, his method for understanding a space. First let it carry you, then understand it. He passed a bookshop he liked the look of but didn't enter, passed a cafe with a line of 12 people, arrived at a wide waiting area with glass walls overlooking the runway, sat down, pulled out the sketchbook, and returned to the building without a function. He didn't look up. He didn't see the girl who arrived 7 minutes later and sat 3 rows away with a green suitcase, a thick book, and hair in a braid that reached the middle of her back. Valentina found a seat next to a column. She liked columns in airports and libraries. In any public space, they offered the illusion of a boundary, that invisible but felt territory people trace around themselves when they're alone among strangers. She set the suitcase between her feet, took out the book, opened it. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad. This time it got in. The waiting area had the standard composition of airports in that era. Families with children running because children in airports always run. Businessmen with briefcases and the face of someone who has had the same phone call 40 times. Older couples moving with a synchronization that only years of shared life can produce. And that species of solitary person no one looks at because solitude in public spaces is the only truly perfect form of invisibility. Valentina was that person that day, though she didn't know it. So was Santiago, though he didn't know it either. She read 40 pages with the focus of a serious reader, one of those people who builds a private room around a book and carries it everywhere. A smaller part of her attention registered the airport without processing it. The woman to her left eating a pastry with near meditative focus, the child who ran past twice in opposite directions, the boarding call for a flight to Medellin. And at some point in the second hour, a laugh. Male, not boisterous, genuine. The kind that sounds as if the person laughing was surprised to find something worth laughing about, as if joy had arrived unannounced and been accepted without resistance. Valentina looked up from the book. She found no one looking back at her. The source was somewhere behind her, blocked by columns and rows of seats. She heard only the laugh, faceless, contextless, nameless. She looked back down at the page. It was as if God had decided to put to the test every capacity for surprise. The laugh came again 10 minutes later. This time, Valentina didn't look up, but she smiled without knowing why. One of those involuntary responses that are more honest than any conscious decision. The source was Santiago on the phone with his friend Camilo, who had the rare ability to make anyone laugh in any circumstance, because his humor consisted of finding the absurd in the ordinary, without malice, without effort. How was Cartagena? Asked Camilo. Same as always. My dad drank. My mom smiled. I drew imaginary buildings. That sounds like a sad indie song. Or a documentary on dysfunctional families. Camilo burst out laughing. So did Santiago. His laugh started in his chest and traveled to his shoulders, made him lean forward slightly, as if someone had given him a gentle shove, the specific sound of genuine, unperformed joy. That was the laugh Valentina heard, twice, and kept without knowing she was keeping it, in that unlabeled file the human brain maintains for things that don't fit a category, but also can't be discarded. After he hung up, Santiago looked back at the sketchbook. The building still needed something in the facade, a break in the rhythm, a larger window, the kind of deliberate absence that in architecture isn't a mistake, but a choice. He looked up. It wasn't a decision. It's what happens when you stop studying a drawing and your field of vision opens and find something it wasn't looking for. He saw her, the braid, the thick book on her knees, the posture of someone completely inside something else. Feet crossed on the seat in a way that was informal and mildly against the rules, the green suitcase between her legs. A girl his age reading with a concentration that struck him in the second and a half before you looked. A way as entirely admirable and mildly enviable because he had never been able to read in noisy places and had always wanted to be the kind of person who could. He went back to the sketch, the larger window, the break in the rhythm. He didn't look up again. At 3:10, Valentina finished chapter 4 and decided she needed coffee. She stood, rolled the green suitcase to the small cafe at the far end of the hall, ordered a small coffee, paid with coins, waited. She took the first sip and confirmed it was the good kind. Thick, dark, with the faintly sweet aftertaste that good Colombian beans carry when someone treats them right. She stayed standing by the counter, drinking slowly, looking at the waiting area from the outside for the first time. An airport waiting room as a mirror of human time, a physical representation of the condition of being between two things, neither at the origin nor the destination. In the meanwhile, which is where life is lived most of the time, though people only notice it in airports. She thought that was a good opening paragraph for something. She didn't yet know what. She stored it in her head to write later in the new notebook when she arrived. She finished the coffee, walked back, past the row where Santiago was sitting, still in the sketchbook, eyes down, and returned to her seat beside the column, book open, without any reason to look at him, and without looking. At 3:20, Santiago's parents arrived with the bags. "The cab comes in 20 minutes, said Rodrigo. Santiago closed the sketchbook and stood. As he grabbed his backpack, his gaze drifted involuntarily toward where the girl with the braid had been reading. She was still there, still reading. There was something, he thought. He couldn't name exactly what. Something about the way that person read that felt. The word he landed on was familiar, though it made no sense, because he had never seen her face. As if that posture, that level of concentration, that quality of being completely inside something else, was something he recognized from before, though he couldn't say from when or where. He thought about saying something. The thought lasted 3 seconds. "Coming?" said his father. "Yes," said Santiago. And the three Maras walked toward the exit. That's how easily the important things are lost. That's how quiet the sound is when an opportunity passes. It was 5 past 5 in the afternoon. Valentina had been in the waiting area for almost 4 hours. She had read 90 pages, had 2 coffees, called her mother. "I got here fine. Mom, the airport is enormous. Yes, I'm cold. Don't worry." And heard in Gloria's voice that relief with the exact weight of love, heavy but clean. She had jotted down 3 things on a piece of paper she would later lose. She had watched dozens of people pass without holding on to any of them. Her flight left at 5:40. She closed the book, packed her things, stood up. And in that moment of transition, that 1 second when the body reorganizes itself for movement, she heard, behind her, very close, no more than 10 feet away, the same laugh. She stopped. Not because she consciously recognized it. At 18, you don't process in real time the connection between a sound heard 2 hours ago and the same sound heard now. But the body does. The body registers these things with a fidelity the mind takes longer to reach. She stood still for 2 seconds that could have been something else. Then she kept walking. Santiago had come back. His parents were outside waiting for the cab, which was running 40 minutes late, and he had found the perfect excuse to avoid being in a closed car with them longer than necessary. He returned to the waiting area because it was the place where he had been at ease for the past few hours. And when he walked in, he saw, right then, that exact second, the girl who had just stood up from a seat next to a column. She had gone still for 2 seconds, without any apparent reason, green suitcase in hand, backpack on her shoulder, something in her posture transmitting an involuntary pause, as if something had asked for a moment, and the body had obeyed without consulting the mind. Then she had started walking. He recognized the braid. He recognized the green suitcase, the girl who was reading, he thought, and he walked toward her. He had to cross 4 rows of seats. She was moving in the opposite direction, toward the boarding gates, unaware that someone was approaching. Santiago walked slowly because he didn't have ready what he would say when he got there. He could design complex structures in his head with perfect clarity, but he couldn't prepare the opening of a conversation with a stranger, because that required the kind of improvisation architecture doesn't teach. "What were you reading?" "Yes, that was honest. It came from something real." And then, "Attention passengers traveling to Florencia, Flight AV 8821. Please proceed to Gate C14. Immediate boarding at Gate C14. The announcement wasn't for either of them, but it came from the same speakers that announced every flight, designed to cut through ambient noise and therefore cutting through thought as well. Santiago stopped, looked up at the nearest screen out of reflex, the automatic habit of airports. Not his flight. But in the 2 seconds it took to confirm that the girl with the braid had turned down the boarding corridor. The curve of the hallway had received her. When Santiago looked back at the place where she had been, she was gone. He stood in the middle of the waiting area, with 10 words unsaid. The book she had been reading, whose cover he never got close enough to see, was 100 Years of Solitude. That wouldn't have changed anything, perhaps. Or perhaps it would have changed everything. That is the kind of question that has no answer, and that falls to me to carry. They had been 10 feet apart. Valentina's boarding gate was B7, Santiago's was a 3, opposite ends of the terminal. Valentina arrived, sat in the last row by the window, and took out the new notebook. She thought. She wrote, "The waiting room is the only place where time tells the truth." She looked at it, liked it. Crossed it out because she liked it too much to leave it alone on a first page that hadn't yet earned the right to hold something that good. She wrote it again below. Then she waited to see what came next. What came next was the boarding call for her flight, the movement of passengers rising, the chain of small actions that carries a person from a seat to a plane. The notebook was left with that single line and a first page half filled, which is perhaps the best way to start a new notebook, with one true thing in the blank space that promises more. Santiago arrived at Gate 3 and found that his flight wasn't for another 2 hours, that his sketchbook was with his father's bags, and that he had nothing to do but sit and think. He thought about the girl with the braid. He thought about how he hadn't spoken to her, about how there was no particular reason to have done so. Airports aren't places of connection but of transit, and talking to strangers in waiting areas was something people did in movies more than in real life. He thought about the 2 seconds she had stood still before walking and told himself there was no reason for that to mean anything. He thought maybe it did. Then he thought about college, about the blueprints, about the building in the sketchbook, about the larger window missing from the facade to interrupt the rhythm. Then he stopped thinking about her, or believed he had. Valentina's plane took off at 6:15. She pressed her forehead against the cold window and watched El Dorado receive with all its lights burning, that brilliant geometry of nighttime airports, which from above looked like deliberate design, a city within a city built specifically to be seen from the sky. Then the entire city unfolded below her, and that was something she was not prepared for. Bogotá at night from the air is one of the most extraordinary things that exists above Colombian soil. It isn't a city that dazzles with perfection. There are more orderly cities, more symmetrical ones from above, but Bogotá has a scale that overwhelms before you can catalog it. Millions of yellow and white lights stretching to where the savanna ends and the mountains begin, and the mountains to the east with their own constellations of houses clinging to the hillsides, as if someone had spilled light down the slopes and the light had decided to stay. Valentina didn't speak. There was no one to speak to, but she wouldn't have been able to anyway. Some things can only be received in silence. She watched the city until the clouds covered it. Then she lowered her forehead from the window, leaned back, and closed her eyes, turning over the day in her mind. Moco before dawn, her mother's arms, the small regional airport, the arrival at El Dorado, the hours in the waiting area, the coffee in the paper cup, chapter 4 of Garcia Marquez. The laugh she had heard twice, which still had no face. She held that laugh in her thoughts for a moment longer than she would have had she been paying attention to herself. Then she fell asleep. At Gate 3, Santiago's flight eventually boarded. He sat by the window, tucked his bag under the seat, put his headphones on. As the plane taxied toward the runway, he looked out at the airport from outside and felt the vague, formless sense of having left something behind. He checked. Sketchbook was with his father, phone in his pocket, boarding pass in hand. Nothing concrete. Just that feeling. The one that comes when you've walked past something that belongs to you without recognizing it. The plane lifted. Bogotá separated them toward different sides of the same city, the way it always does with things that haven't yet found their moment to meet. And I, who had watched them both throughout that entire day, who had measured the distances and counted the seconds and known at every moment what neither of them knew remained there in the empty waiting area, holding the weight of what hadn't happened, which is, of all the things that exist, the hardest thing to hold. The green suitcase reached its destination that night. The sketchbook with the purposeless building ended up on a desk in Bogotá. Neither of them yet knew the other's name. Neither knew this was only the first of several beginnings that would not become beginnings. Not yet. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2, The Same Rain. 2010, 21 years old, 3 years passed. 3 years in which they lived in the same city, breathed the same altitude, complained about the same rain. 3 years in which the distance between them was sometimes no more than a building, a corridor, a name neither had learned to say. I watched. I always watch. And I will tell you this, proximity is not the same thing as closeness. 2 people can share a sky for 1,000 days and still be strangers. The city doesn't care. The city just keeps raining. Bogotá had taken Valentina 3 months to stop resisting. That was the honest version, the one she would tell years later when the city had already become something she couldn't imagine leaving. The first 3 months she had been cold, lost, quietly overwhelmed by a scale she understood intellectually, but couldn't absorb physically, the way you can read about the ocean and still be unprepared the first time you stand at its edge. Bogotá was not a city you simply arrived in. It was a city that demanded a negotiation. You had to decide at some point whether you were going to let it be bigger than you or whether you were going to grow to meet it. Valentina decided to grow. It hadn't been fast or easy. She had cried in her room in the student residence twice in the first month, quietly, efficiently, the way she did most things that needed to be done, and then had gotten up, washed her face, and gone back out into the city as if the crying had been a transaction she'd completed and could now move past. She had learned the Transmillennial bus system with the methodical determination she brought to everything new, first observing, then mapping, then moving through it with the confidence of someone who had always known how. She had discovered that Bogotá rewarded precisely the kind of stubbornness she had been carrying around since childhood without knowing it had a use. By the end of that first year, she knew the city. By the end of the second, the city knew her, or at least, certain parts of it did. The journalism school quarters, the library on the east side of campus with its wooden chairs and its particular smell of old paper and floor wax. The 2 blocks of La Candelaria where the used bookshops were so dense you could spend an entire afternoon moving from one to the next and never feel you had wasted it. The cafe on Cara Septima where the owner made the coffee the way it was supposed to be made, and where a table in the back had, over the course of many months, become something close to hers. She was 21 now, 3rd year. Her hair was shorter. She had cut it the previous January in an impulsive act she had not regretted, and she had traded the trenza for a loose knot that she put up every morning without thinking about it, the way you stop thinking about habits once they become yours. She wrote constantly, articles for the university paper, notes in the margins of everything she read, long letters to her mother that were really a form of journal, and in the evenings, in the notebook that had succeeded the first one and then the third, and was now its 6th iteration, something that wasn't journalism and wasn't quite fiction but lived in the space between them where she was most comfortable. She had a boyfriend. His name was Andres, and he was 23, and he was studying political science, and he was the kind of person who filled rooms, not with noise, exactly, but with a quality of presence that made other people in the room feel that something was happening. He was smart and he knew it, which would have been insufferable in someone less genuinely curious. But in Andres, the intelligence was restless rather than satisfied, always moving toward the next thing to understand, the next argument to dismantle and rebuild better. Valentina had fallen for the curiosity first, then the long conversations. Then the way he looked at her sometimes when she was talking, with a focus so complete it felt like being read by someone who actually wanted to understand the text. They had been together 14 months. 14 months was long enough to know someone's rhythms and short enough to still be surprised by them sometimes, which was the particular tension of that phase of a relationship, the space between I think I know you and I know you, which could be the most exciting place to be or the most exhausting, depending on what you found there. With Andres, it was increasingly the second. Valentina didn't say this out loud. She didn't say it even to herself with any consistency. Because 21 is an age at which you are still in the habit of arguing with your own perceptions, of deciding that what you feel must be wrong before you decide it might be right. She registered the exhaustion the way you register a sound you can't quite identify. Present, recurring, not yet classified. She put it aside. She went to class. She wrote. She met Andres for dinner on Thursdays and on weekend afternoons when their schedules aligned, which was less often lately, and she told herself that less often was normal, that all relationships had rhythms, that the distance she had started to feel between them on some evenings was atmospheric and temporary, like the Bogotá cold, permeating but not permanent. She was wrong about that. But she didn't know it yet. Santiago had arrived at the National University of Colombia with his sketchbooks and his silences and his very specific ideas about space, and had found, to his cautious surprise, that he had arrived somewhere he fit. Not in the social sense. He had never fit easily in the social sense, and had long since made his peace with that, but in the deeper sense of having found a place whose logic matched his own. The architecture school understood that buildings were not just functional objects, but arguments about how humans should live, and that designing a space meant making a series of decisions about what mattered and what didn't, about what you wanted to protect and what you wanted to expose. That was a language Santiago had been speaking in his head since he was 12, and hearing it spoken out loud by people who took it seriously was a thing he had not known he needed until he had it. He was good. He knew he was good the way you know a thing that isn't vanity but simple accuracy. The way a musician knows they have pitch, not with pride but with factual recognition. His projects had a quality his professors described variously as restraint, clarity, and on one occasion an unusual emotional intelligence for someone who doesn't seem particularly interested in emotions, which was the most accurate thing anyone had said about him in years. His first year at the university, he had made 2 friends. Camilo, who was not in architecture but in industrial design, and who had the gift of making Santiago laugh without trying. And Isabella, who was in his year and who was the best student in their program and who had decided within the first month that Santiago was useful to think alongside, which was her highest form of compliment. The 3 of them had formed the kind of friendship that happens when people who don't need company find each other and discover that not needing something and wanting it are different things. He was 21, 3rd year. Taller than he had been at 18, not much, but perceptibly, and the sketchbooks had multiplied. He kept one for architecture work and a separate one for the drawings that weren't for class, the buildings that still didn't have functions, but had grown more complex over time, as if they were developing their own logic without his direction. He was not in a relationship. He'd been briefly in 2nd year with a girl named Sophia who was studying literature and who was kind and interesting, and with whom he had shared 4 months of something that was good but not quite right, in the way that some things are good and not right simultaneously. And they had parted with the particular civility of 2 people who respect each other enough to be honest when honesty is the kinder option. He didn't think about it much. He thought about buildings. He thought about the way the light came through the studio windows in the late afternoon and the fact that nobody had designed the building with that light in mind, but it was the best thing about the building, which was a lesson he filed carefully. Sometimes the most beautiful things in a space are the accidental ones, and the job of a good architect is to be humble enough to leave room for accidents. He thought about his father occasionally, about Rodrigo, who had been less present since Santiago left for university and who communicated primarily through short phone calls that were really updates rather than conversations, as if they were business associates maintaining a professional relationship that neither could quite end. He thought about his mother more, about Lusa, who had started painting the year Santiago left, watercolors mostly, flowers, and small domestic scenes, and who seemed, in a way she'd never permitted herself before, to be becoming someone. He was glad for her. He was also aware that her becoming required the absence of an audience, and that he had been part of that audience without knowing it. That was the age of a particular kind of understanding, 21. When you begin to see your parents not as the fixed poles of your world, but as people, in the middle of their own stories, and the vertigo of that perception is something nobody warns you about. He put it aside. He went to studio. He drew. He met Camilo and Isabella for lunch when their schedules overlapped, and he walked to the library in the afternoons because the library was the right kind of quiet, the productive kind, the kind where silence had specific weight, and everybody in the room was contributing to it collectively by also being silent, which was a form of cooperation Santiago found more natural than most. The library on the east side of campus, the one with the wooden chairs and the smell of old paper and floor wax. The same one. I should tell you something about the library. It had 3 floors. The ground floor was for general collections, and it was the noisiest, with students coming and going and the circulation desk and the particular friction of a public space trying to be a private one. The 2nd floor was periodicals and reference, which most students avoided because it required a different kind of patience. The 3rd floor was where the serious work happened. Long tables, individual reading carols along the windows, a rule about absolute silence that was actually enforced, and that quality of collective concentration that feels, when you are inside it, like a kind of shelter. Valentina worked on the 3rd floor. She had claimed to spot that the long table on the north side, 2nd chair from the left end, facing the window that looked toward the humanities building as her own. Not officially, but in the way that people claim spots they return to consistently enough that other people eventually stop sitting there out of some social instinct that recognizes territory without needing a sign. She went on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday afternoons between 2 and 6 with her laptop and her current notebook and whatever book she was working from, and she spent those hours in a state of focused production that was the closest she came to happiness without needing to name it as such. Santiago worked on the third floor. He had claimed a spot at the same long table, third chair from the right end, which placed him at the opposite side with roughly 8 people's worth of space between them on most days. Not because he had chosen that table specifically, but because the first time he went to the third floor. It was the table with the best light, the kind that came through the north window in the late afternoon and fell at the right angle for drawing without casting shadow on the page. He went on Tuesday, Thursday, and sometimes Saturday mornings, with his sketchbooks and his technical drafting materials and whatever reading he was supposed to have done for studio. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday. They never went on the same day. I want you to understand this. The building was the same, the floor was the same, the table was the same. If you had placed their chairs side by side, they would have been touching. They sat at the same surface, breathed the same air, contributed to the same silence. On the days the other was not there, each of them occupied a space that still held the faint impression of the other's presence. The small indentations in the wooden surface, the particular arrangement of available light. They never went on the same day, for 6 months. I counted. The professor's name was Diego Valenzuela, and he taught a course called Narrative Space that existed in the strange and productive overlap between journalism and architecture, a seminar about the way physical environments tell stories, the way a building can be read like a text, the way the spaces where we live shape not just our movements, but our perceptions and our language. It was an elective. Valentina had chosen it because the course description had used the phrase architecture as argument, which was a combination of words she had not encountered before, and that produced in her the specific excitement of finding a door she didn't know existed. Santiago had chosen it because Isabella had taken it the previous year and described it as the only class in which someone had finally talked about buildings, the way he thought about buildings, as things with intentions, things that made claims about the world. They were in the same class. 54 students in a room with tiered seating and large projection screens on Tuesday and Thursday mornings from 8 to 10. Santiago sat in the third row, left side, which gave him a clear view of the projections and enough distance from the professor to draw on the margins of his notes without being obvious. Valentina sat in the fifth row right side, which gave her a slight elevation advantage for seeing the room as well as the screen, which was how she had always preferred to sit in any space, with enough perspective to see both the subject and the audience. "What are you drawing?" she asked, nodding toward the sketchbook again. He turned it toward her without hesitation. She looked at it seriously, not with the polite appreciation people offer when shown creative work they don't understand, but with actual attention, the way she read things. He watched her look at it with the careful discomfort of showing something personal to someone whose opinion you have already, without fully meaning to, started to care about. "It's an interior," she said. "Yes, what's it for?" "Nothing specific. I draw buildings that don't have programs. Without a function, they have to justify themselves through form alone." She looked at him. "That's what I do with writing sometimes," she said. "I write things that aren't for anything, to see if they're true without a purpose." A silence in which both of them heard the parallel they'd just drawn. "Does it work?" he asked. "Sometimes, you?" "Sometimes," he said. It was 6:15 when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Her expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that told a whole story, but enough that he saw it. A small contraction around the eyes, a barely perceptible straightening of posture, the way people adjust themselves before taking a call they have complicated feelings about. "Sorry," she said and answered. "Hey, yes, I'm here." "Are you? Okay, I'll look for you." She hung up and gathered her jacket from the back of the chair. "My boyfriend's outside," she said, and the word boyfriend landed in the space between them with the precise weight it was supposed to have. Not heavy enough to be an announcement, but there, present, a fact about the shape of her life that he now had to receive and incorporate. He received it. He incorporated it, his expression didn't change. "Of course," he said. She picked up her bag, paused for a second, just one, in the way that people pause when they're deciding whether there is something left to say or whether the appropriate thing is simply to go. "That was a good conversation," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Good luck with Falenzula, you too." "With the writing?" She smiled, briefly, genuinely, without performance, and walked toward the door. Through the glass he could see the street outside, the rain still falling in that steady, unhurried way, and a man waiting under the awning with his collar turned up against the cold. Tall, dark coat. He saw her come out and reach for her hand, and she let him take it, and they walked away together under the awning's edge until the rain took them. Santiago looked at his sketchbook. The drawing of the interior was still on the page. The grid of windows, the falling light. He looked at it for a long moment without adding anything. Then he turned to a new page. He didn't know her last name. He didn't know which part of the campus she was on, which days she came to the library, whether she was in any of the buildings he walked through every day. He knew she was from somewhere with practical architecture. He knew she wrote things that weren't for anything to see if they were true. He knew she had listened to his explanation of drawings without function, the way you listen to something that confirms what you already suspected. He knew she had a boyfriend and that the word had sat in her mouth for a half second before she said it, which was a thing he noticed and then deliberately put aside, because noticing things like that was a road that went somewhere he had not been asked to go. He opened to the new page and started a new drawing, an exterior this time. A building with no function but a very particular facade. One large window off-center, interrupting the rhythm of the wall. The kind of window that looked like a mistake to people who didn't understand why it was there, and like the only possible right decision to anyone who did. He didn't know it was the same window he had been trying to place since the airport 3 years ago. Some things are patient. Outside, under the awning, and then released from it into the rain, Valentina walked beside Andres while he talked about his day. She listened. She was good at listening. It was something people often said about her. That she actually listened. That she was present in conversations in a way that felt different from the performance of attention that most people offered. She listened to Andres. She also thought, at the same time, which was something she was capable of with the particular multitasking of minds that are used to, working on several registers simultaneously about the conversation in the cafe. About the way someone had listened back, not performing attention, actually having it. About the parallel between buildings without function and writing without purpose that she hadn't expected to find. About the sketchbook page, the interior, the windows. She walked. The rain fell. Andres said something and she laughed. Not dishonestly, she had laughed, but from a place that was slightly less present than usual. Slightly behind herself, like the feeling she had described at the table before she knew she was describing herself. She thought she should go back to the cafe sometime. It was a good place to work. She didn't let herself think the rest of the thought, which was that it had been a better place to work that afternoon than it usually was, for a reason that had sat across the table from her for an hour and 20 minutes, and had known to turn the sketchbook around without being asked. She was 21. She was in a relationship. She was, as she had told herself many times in the preceding weeks, fine. She was fine. The rain fell on both of them equally, as rain does, without interest in what either of them was thinking, without any awareness of what it had briefly sheltered. They were in the same class for the rest of the semester. I want you to know that. Twice a week, 3rd row left and 5th row right, separated by the diagonal of a tiered classroom and the particular geometry of not having been formally introduced in an environment where formal introduction is not the custom. They did not speak again. Not because either of them decided not to, neither made a decision of any kind. They simply existed in adjacent orbits, in the way that the city contains millions of people in adjacent orbits, people whose stories rhyme without touching, people who are sometimes 3 rows and sometimes 3 feet and sometimes 3 years apart from something that could have been the most important thing that ever happened to them. Once, in November, Valentina arrived at the journalism building and the elevator was occupied when it arrived, and she stepped back to wait for the next one, and Santiago stepped out of that elevator without looking up from the notes in his hand. and they were less than a foot apart for the 2 seconds it took him to turn toward the exit corridor and her to enter the elevator and press the button for her floor. Neither of them saw it. I did? Once, in December, the last week of classes, Santiago was leaving the library, the 3rd floor, the long table, the good light, and he passed the north side of the table on his way to the stairs. On the wooden surface, at the 2nd chair from the left end, there was a notebook. Abandoned, apparently, left by whoever had been sitting there, which was not Santiago because he sat on the other side. He stopped, looked at it. The cover was dark blue, worn at the corners, with nothing written on the outside. He should, he knew, take it to the circulation desk on the 1st floor. He picked it up. He did not open it, because you do not open someone's notebook. He carried it downstairs and left it with the librarian, who made a note of where it had been found, and he went back into the rain that was, as always that December, falling. The notebook was Valentina's 6th. She had left it that morning in the rush of having her phone ring and her bag already on her, shoulder in her mind on the conversation she was walking into. She came back for it 2 hours later, found it at the circulation desk, and thanked the librarian, who told her that a student from the architecture school had brought it down. She looked at the notebook in her hands, thought about that for a moment. Then she opened to where she had left off and wrote 2 pages of something that wasn't journalism and wasn't quite fiction. She didn't know that the hands that had carried the notebook down 4 flights of stairs were the same hands she'd watched turn a sketchbook around without being asked. Didn't know that the building in that sketchbook had a window. That had been waiting to find its place since long before she sat down across from it in the rain. The semester ended. They went home for the holidays on different days. The library closed for 2 weeks, and the table on the north side of the 3rd floor held no one, and the space that had been theirs on alternate days became simply a table again, neutral, unclaimed, as patient as the city around it. Patient because cities that rain that much learn patience. Patient because some things are not finished. They are only interrupted. Not yet. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3, The Interview. 2014, 25 years old, 4 years is a long time, and it is also nothing at all. In 4 years, a person can become someone else entirely and still recognize themselves in the mirror. In 4 years, a city can tear down a building and put up another one, and everyone forgets what was there before. In 4 years, 2 people can graduate, grieve, grow, move 3 times, love badly, and then more carefully and arrive, without knowing it, at the same door on the same Tuesday morning in January. The door, in this case, was on the 12th floor of a corporate tower on Kill 93, where a magazine called Forma was looking for 2 things: a staff writer who understood architecture and an editorial designer who understood narrative. I have always found it remarkable how specific coincidences have to be in order to feel accidental. Valentina had been awake since 5:30. Not because she was anxious, or not only because of that. She had always been an early riser, one of those people whose body treats sleep as a task to be completed efficiently rather than a pleasure to be extended. And by 5:30, her mind was already running at the velocity that most people reached after 2 cups of coffee. But that morning, there was something underneath the ordinary hum of wakefulness. A low frequency of nerves she had been managing since the night before, with the pragmatic attention she brought to everything she wanted, and was afraid of wanting too much. She wanted this job. Forma was not the kind of magazine you stumbled into. It had been published monthly since 1998, was read by architects and urban planners and the particular overlap of cultural thinkers who cared about the relationship between spaces, and the people who inhabited them, had won 2 international journalism awards and been cited in 3 architectural textbooks, and was edited by a woman named Claudia Reyes, whose own writing Valentina had been reading since she was 19, and who had a quality of precision and warmth simultaneously that Valentina considered the highest thing journalism could aspire to. She had applied on a Thursday. The call had come the following Monday. The interview was today. She stood in front of her closet for 11 minutes, not because she couldn't decide, but because she was thinking. And thinking while standing in front of an open closet was a habit from Moko. From the small room with the map on the ceiling, From the mornings when getting dressed was the only physical ritual available for organizing the mind before the day began. She chose dark trousers, a white shirt, a blazer she had for 3 years and liked because it fit the way clothes fit when they've learned your body. She pulled her hair back with the practiced ease of someone who has made the same decision long enough not to consider it a decision anymore. She took the Transmilenio because she always took the Transmilenio, because she decided years ago that she was not the kind of person who took taxes to things just because the things mattered. That arriving at a job interview by bus was not a statement about the interview, but about the person doing the interviewing. She arrived 18 minutes early. The building on Kale 93 was 12 floors of glass and concrete that made no particular argument about itself, neither beautiful nor offensive. The architectural equivalent of a neutral tone, a building that knew its purpose was to contain other things rather than to be a thing itself. Valentina stood in the lobby for a moment and noted this with the habit of observation she'd developed in. Valenzuela's class and never fully lost. The lobby had good bones, high ceilings, a generous proportion, but someone had furnished it without curiosity, which was the most common failure of corporate interiors. She went up to the 12th floor. The receptionist directed her to the waiting area outside Human Resources, which was a small room with 4 chairs, a low table with a glass of water and a stack of recent issues of Forma, and a window that looked toward the mountains. Valentina sat, picked up the topmost issue, and opened it not to read, but to have something to do with her hands while her mind organized itself. She was the only one in the room for 4 minutes. Santiago came in at 9:52. He was wearing a dark jacket over a gray shirt with no tie, which was the result of approximately the same amount of deliberation Valentina had applied to her own choices. And he had the particular quality of someone who looks composed but has been awake longer than the composure suggests. He was 25, and the 4 years since university had done to him what they do to most people who spend them actually working. They had removed the provisional quality that student life gives a person and replaced it with something more settled, more specific, like a drawing that has been rendered from pencil sketch to final ink. He had spent 2 years after graduating at an architecture firm in Bogota that did mostly corporate projects, the kind of work that paid well, and taught him precision but not much else, and another year as a junior designer at a cultural foundation that had interesting projects and no budget, which was the opposite problem. He had published 2 articles in architectural journals and designed the visual language for a small exhibition about urban housing in Bogota, and had done both of these things at night and on weekends while the day job continued. Because the day job paid the rent, but the night work was the reason he got up in the morning. He had seen the formal listing for an editorial designer and had read it 3 times before applying, because the combination of what they were looking for, someone with architectural training and a narrative sensibility, someone who understood that the design of a page was not decoration but argument, was so precisely described that it felt less like a job posting, and more like someone had reached into his head and articulated something he had never managed to say about himself. He sat in one of the 4 chairs, picked up a glass of water from the table, looked toward the window, the mountains, looked at Valentina. She looked up from the magazine at the same moment. And here is what I want to tell you about that first direct look between them, the first one in which both were present simultaneously, both looking. It lasted approximately 2 seconds and contained approximately nothing in the sense that there was no recognition, no narrative, no sense of where do I know you from. They were 2 strangers in a waiting room, arriving at the mutual acknowledgement that strangers in small spaces must arrive at, the brief, neutral glance that says, I see that you are here, and I have no particular feelings about it, which is the standard social contract of waiting rooms and elevators and any space in which proximity is circumstantial rather than chosen. 2 seconds, and then they both looked elsewhere. I want to be honest with you. I had hoped, by this point, for something. Some flicker of recognition, some bodily knowledge that the other was not entirely a stranger. The airport, after all. The rain, the library table. The notebook carried down 4 flights of stairs by hands that didn't know what they were carrying. Nothing. Which is the correct outcome. Physiologically and neurologically speaking, there was no reason for either of them to recognize the other. The data was insufficient. The context had been too brief and too separated. But I will tell you that the absence of recognition in that moment is one of the things I carry with the most weight. Because they'd been so close so many times in the exact conditions of proximity and mutual interest that connection requires. And here they were again, and the body had no record. Only I had the record. 8 minutes passed in which each of them existed in their respective corners of the waiting room, managing their respective pre-interview internal states. Valentina had reread the same paragraph 4 times and decided to stop pretending she was reading and just look at the mountains through the window instead, which was more honest and also more useful, because looking at the mountains of Bogota from a 12th floor window has a particular quality of perspective that is genuinely calming. The mountains are too large and too old to be interested in your interview. Santiago had set down the glass of water and was looking at the issues of forma on the table without picking one up, in the manner of someone who has read them all already and knows it would be the wrong kind of performance to read them again now. At 9:59, Valentina said, "Are you here for the designer position?" Not because she needed to know, or not only because of that. She asked because the silence had passed the point of comfortable and entered the territory of the kind of silence that is more effort to maintain than to break, and because she was, at her core, a person who found other people more interesting than silence, and because the question was benign and the alternative was 9 more minutes of staring at separate mountains. He looked at her, same neutral assessment as before, receiving the question, processing the question, responding to the question. "Yes, you're here for the writing position?" "Staff writer, yes." He nodded. "Have you read the magazine?" she asked. "For years." Claudia Reyes. "The piece she did last year on the informal settlements in Medellin," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not performing enthusiasm, actually having it, that shifted the register slightly. "I read it 4 times. Valentina looked at him more carefully. "I read it 4 times too," she said. "I used it in a seminar discussion. We argued about it for an hour and a half. What was the argument? Whether the act of writing beautifully about poverty aestheticizes it, whether a well-constructed sentence about a broken roof is a service or a betrayal." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone thinking of something to say, but the quiet of someone who has been handed a question they actually want to answer. "I think the opposite problem is more common," he said. "Writing about difficult things badly, with the mistaken idea that plainness is neutrality. The craft isn't the problem. The craft is the only way to make someone actually feel the weight of what you're describing." Valentina looked at him across the low table and the stack of forma issues and the glass of water. "That's what I said," she said. They were in that waiting room for 41 minutes. I counted. Of course I counted. The human resources assistant came out at 10 and said that the first interview was running slightly behind, which was the kind of information that in any other circumstance produces mild irritation, and in this particular circumstance produced, though neither of them would have said so, a small involuntary relief. 41 minutes! In those 41 minutes, they talked about forma and about Claudia Reyes, and about what it meant to design a magazine page versus design a building. Whether the principles transferred or whether they only appeared to transfer, which was a distinction Santiago drew carefully and which Valentina pushed back on with the instinct of someone who has been trained to test the structural integrity of arguments. They talked about the city. He said that Bogota was a city that was always in the process of becoming something other than what it was, but it had a chronic dissatisfaction with itself that was both its greatest flaw and its most interesting quality. She said that she had felt that when she arrived from Moco, the sense of a city that was perpetually mid-sentence, and that the only way to live in it was to become the same way, perpetually mid-sentence yourself. He asked about Moco without the questions people usually asked. Not where is that or isn't it near the Amazon, but simply, what's it like to have come from somewhere that small to somewhere this large? And she answered honestly, which she did not always do with that question. It takes years to stop feeling like you're getting away with something. Like the city is going to figure out you're from somewhere else and revoke your permission to be here. He listened to that in the way she had already in the first 3 minutes of the conversation, identified as his particular quality, with actual attention, not the performance of it. the gaze steady and the silence after her words, not an emptiness to fill, but a space in which what she had said was genuinely being received. "I grew up here," he said, "and I spent most of it feeling like the city had made a mistake putting me in it. So I think it might not be about where you come from." She looked at him. "What's it about then?" "I haven't worked that out yet." She laughed, briefly, genuinely, the laugh that happens when someone says something that is honest and unexpectedly funny simultaneously. He smiled at the sound of it, and I want to tell you about that moment, about the precise quality of that exchange, the confession and the laugh and the smile, because it had a clarity I rarely see in the first minutes of two people talking. Not the performed intimacy of people who have decided to be charming, but the accidental intimacy of people who have momentarily stopped managing the impression they're making and said something true. It is the rarest thing in human interaction. It usually takes hours to arrive at, or drinks, or a crisis of some kind. In 41 minutes in a waiting room, they arrived at it in 20. She told him she had studied at the National University. He said the same. Journalism, third-floor library on alternate afternoons. Architecture, third-floor library on the alternate alternates. The table by the north window, she said. He looked at her. "The long one? Second chair from the left?" You sat on the other side. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I left a notebook there once," she said. "Someone brought it to the circulation desk." He was still looking at her. Something was moving in his expression that wasn't quite recognition. It was more like the architectural equivalent. The moment when you're studying a building and realize a feature you thought was decorative is actually structural. "I found a notebook on that table once," he said slowly. Dark blue, worn at the corners. Valentina stared at him. "I brought it to the librarian," he said. "I didn't open it." A silence. "That was mine," she said. The silence continued for another beat. Both of them sat with the information, with its specific weight, with the quiet vertigo of retrospective near connection, the feeling of reaching back in time and finding that what you thought was an empty corridor was actually occupied. "We must have been on opposite days," she said. "Every day, apparently." She shook her head slightly. Not in negation, in that gesture that means the improbability of this is almost too much to process. "Did you take Valenzuela's class?" she asked. Narrative space. His expression confirmed it before he spoke. "Second semester, third year," he said. "I took it the year before." He said the enrollment was never more than 50 people. 54 my year, I sat third row, left side. Fifth row, right side. Another silence. The kind that arrives when two people are computing the geometry of how close they have been to each other without knowing it, and the numbers keep coming back unreasonably small. "There's a cafe on Cura Septima," she said, half to herself. He looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read because it contained too many things simultaneously. Surprise, recognition, something that might have been called amusement if it weren't also clearly something else, something with more weight. "You were there once," he said, "in the rain. You asked if anyone was sitting at my table." Valentina looked at him. She remembered the cafe. She remembered the rain. She remembered a conversation that had lasted an hour and 20 minutes, and a sketchbook turned toward her without hesitation and a parallel drawn between buildings without function and writing without purpose. She had not connected the voice to this face, because the voice in the cafe had belonged to a stranger named Santiago, and this face had belonged, until 11 minutes ago, to a different stranger named Santiago, and the human brain is not built to collate these things in real time. But standing back from it now, she could see it. The stillness. The way of receiving a question before answering. The specific quality of a silence that was productive rather than empty. "That was you," she said. "That was me. We talked for over an hour." "We did, and then you were in Valenzuela's class." "And then we were at the same table in the library on different days for 6 months." She laughed again, but it was a different laugh this time. Softer, with an undertone of something that was not quite disbelief and not quite grief, but lived in the territory between them. The place where improbable things settle when you don't have a better category. "This is absurd," she said. "It really is." They talked differently after that. The information had changed the quality of the conversation. The way a key change alters the emotional register of a piece of music. The notes are different, but the progression is the same. And somehow the change makes everything that came before make sense retrospectively. They were not getting to know each other from scratch. They were retroactively filling in the background of someone they had, it turned out, been getting to know in fragments for 7 years. He told her about the firm, about the corporate projects that paid and the cultural work that didn't, about the exhibition he had designed and what he had learned from it about the relationship between visual language and argument. She told him about the years of staff journalism at a Bogota cultural paper that had published, her work and constrained it in equal measure, about the pieces she had written at night that were more honest than the pieces she had written for the paper, about why Forma specifically felt like the right place, not just a better job, but a different kind of work in which the form and the content were allowed to speak to each other. He said that was exactly how he would describe what he wanted the design job to be. She said she knew. He said, "You could tell?" She said, "You said the craft is the only way to make someone feel the weight of what you're describing. That's not a functional argument. That's an ethical one." He looked at her with that expression that was difficult to categorize, that contained too many things. "You have a very precise way of hearing," he said. "It's the journalism," she said. "Or it's the writing, or it's the same thing." A pause. "I think you're going to get this job," he said. Not with the false generosity of someone offering a compliment, but with the factual tone of someone reporting an observation. "You don't know that." "I know that you understand what the magazine is trying to do better than most people who've read it for years." I could hear it in the first 10 minutes. She looked at him, did not deflect the observation, received it, which was its own kind of honesty. "I think you're going to get it too," she said. He shook his head, not negating the compliment, but with something more complicated in the motion. "I'm good," he said. "But I'm not yet the version of myself that wins this kind of thing. I need 2 more years and I don't have them yet." It was a remarkably clear-eyed thing to say about yourself. Valentina filed it the way she filed things that told her something true about a person. The assistant opened the door at 10:41. "Ms. Ruiz? They're ready for you." Valentina stood, gathered her portfolio, straightened her jacket with a small, automatic gesture of someone entering a room that matters. She looked at Santiago. There was a moment, one of those moments that are longer than their duration, that carry more than can be said in the time available, in which both of them were aware simultaneously that whatever had just happened in this waiting room was the kind of thing that deserves a continuation, that deserves at minimum a "let's continue this," that 41 minutes was not enough, and both of them knew it. "Good luck," she said. "You too, not that you need it." She smiled. Genuine, quick, the smile that didn't perform anything. And then she went through the door. The interview lasted 50 minutes. Claudia Reyes was exactly what her writing had led Valentina to expect. Precise, warm, curious with a specificity that felt like respect rather than interrogation. She asked Valentina about 3 pieces from her portfolio and about 1 piece that was not in the portfolio because Valentina had not thought it professional enough to include, which Reyes had found through the university archive and read anyway, which meant she had done her research and meant it. She asked what Valentina thought the relationship between architecture and journalism was, and Valentina gave the honest answer, which was that both were forms of argument about how people should inhabit space, physical space, emotional space, and that the magazine did this better than anything else she had read. Reyes looked at her across the desk. "We need someone who understands the subject from the inside," she said. "Not an architecture journalist who explains the field to outsiders. Someone who lives in the overlap." "I live in the overlap," Valentina said. It was the truest thing she said in the room. She came out at 11:30. The waiting room was empty. The 4 chairs, the low table, the glass of water now removed, the stack of Forma issues slightly displaced from where they had been. One of them, the one Valentina had picked up and not read, left at a slightly different angle than the others. Santiago was not there. She stood in the small room for a moment with her portfolio under her arm, and the conversation still resonating. In her and the way good conversations do, like a note that continues sounding after the instrument has stopped. She'd expected him to be there. She had not examined that expectation or named it, but it had been present, and its disappointment was disproportionately sharp for someone she had technically known for 41 minutes in this room, plus an hour and 20 minutes in a cafe 3 years ago, plus various fragments of unrealized adjacency, stretching back to a rainy morning in an airport when she was 18. She went to the elevator, pressed the lobby button, looked at her reflection in the elevator's brushed metal door, a version of herself slightly distorted by the texture of the surface, which was something she had noticed about elevator reflections before, that they showed you a version of yourself that was recognizable but slightly wrong, slightly other, like a photograph taken by someone who knew you well but not completely. She thought about what he had said. I need 2 more years and I don't have them yet. The self-knowledge of that. The precision. She thought about the library table and the notebook carried down 4 flights of stairs. She thought about the rain and the sketchbook turned without hesitation, and the parallel she hadn't expected to find. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. She walked through the corporate atrium with its good bones and its incurious furniture and out through the glass doors into the Bogota morning, which was cold and bright in the way Bogota is occasionally bright in January. The sky that particular shade of high-altitude blue that looks borrowed from somewhere more dramatic. She did not have his number. She did not know his last name. She had not asked, and he had not offered, and the 41 minutes had been full enough of other things that these practical matters had not come up, which was itself a quality of that conversation that it had been too real to be efficient. She stood on the sidewalk outside the tower and looked at the street and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she should have asked. That she should have said, "This is a strange and remarkable thing, all of these almost encounters, and I would like to know how this story continues. And here's my number, and here's my name in full, not just the first name you already have." She should have said that. She hadn't. She started walking toward the Transmilenio station. Santiago came out of his interview at 11:15. It had gone well in the ways that don't necessarily matter and less well in the ways that do. And he had known it while it was happening with the kind of clean self-awareness that is both a gift and its own particular difficulty. The design director had liked his portfolio, had been impressed by the exhibition work, had asked about his experience with editorial design specifically, layout, typography, the relationship between image and text in a print context, and Santiago had answered honestly that his experience was limited, that most of his work had been spatial rather than print, but he understood the principles, but not yet their specific application to the magazine medium. "We're looking for someone who can do this now," the director had said, not unkindly. Not someone who could do it in 2 years. Santiago had nodded. He had known. He had come out into the waiting room, where the chairs were empty and the glass of water had been removed, and Valentina was presumably still in her interview on the other side of the door, a fact he was aware of, which was the reason for the particular quality of his exit. He could have waited. There was no practical reason not to wait. He had nowhere urgent to be. The lobby had chairs. The building had a cafe on the ground floor. Waiting for 20 minutes while someone finished an interview was not a significant imposition on the day. But he had the specific sensation of a man who's just been told gracefully and clearly that he was not yet what was needed. And that sensation had a texture he recognized, not humiliation. Nothing as dramatic as that, but something closer to the quiet knowledge of one's own unreadiness. And he was not at his best when he had that sensation. And he was not sure he wanted to be seen by her in the particular way that not being at his best made him visible. Which was its own kind of answer about something. He didn't examine it. He took the elevator down, walked through the lobby, went out into the January morning that was cold and bright, the sky that shaded blue it borrowed on its better days. He stood on the sidewalk. He was aware that in 15 minutes, approximately, she would come through those same glass doors. He was also aware that if he stayed on this block for 15 minutes, that would be a decision of a certain kind. And he wasn't sure he was ready to make a decision of that kind from this particular emotional state. He started walking toward the Transmilenio, away from the building, into the city's morning traffic of bodies and buses and cold air. He was 3 blocks away when the thought came clearly. I don't know her last name. He stopped on the sidewalk, stood there for a moment, which the people around him navigated with the practiced indifference of Bogota pedestrians, who have long since decided that people who stop suddenly on sidewalks are someone else's problem. He stood there and understood that he had, once again, walked away from something with his hands empty. Not because it was the wrong thing to do, he had reasons. They were real reasons, but because the accumulation of reasons for walking away from the thing was starting to look, from the outside, like a pattern. He stood on the sidewalk for 45 seconds. Then he turned around. He walked back toward the tower on Kale 93, through the glass doors, across the lobby, into the elevator, back up to the 12th floor. The waiting room was empty. He stood in it for a moment. 4 chairs, low table, the stack of forma issues at a slightly different angle. The window with the view of the mountains. The faint residue of a conversation that had happened here this morning and had been better than most conversations he'd had in years. The assistant appeared at the door. "Can I help you? I had an interview earlier. I left something." He hadn't, but he needed a plausible reason to be in the room, and this was the only one available in the time he had. In the waiting area, the assistant looked at the chairs, the table. "I don't see anything," she said. "You're right," he said. "I must have it." He went back to the elevator, down, out. He stood on the sidewalk again, in the January sun that was making a sincere effort but couldn't fully overcome the altitude, and he looked at the building and understood what he had done, which was arrive 2 minutes late for something he should have waited for. She had been in that room. He had missed her by the duration of an elevator ride. I know because I was there. I'm always there. 3 days later, the call came. Valentina was at her desk in the small apartment in Chapinero she had rented the previous year, the one with the window facing east that got the morning light at the right angle and which she had chosen for that reason above all others, when her phone rang and the number was from Forma and she answered it, and Claudia Reyes offered her the position in the specific way that good editors offer good things, directly, without theatrical preamble, as if the decision had been made by the quality of the work, and it would be almost insulting to pretend otherwise. Valentina said yes. She sat for a moment after hanging up with the phone still in her hand, and the feeling that moved through her was large and clean and genuine, the feeling of having worked toward something for years and finding that the work had been correct, that the direction had been right, that the specific combination of everything she was had turned out to be what was needed for this particular door. She called her mother. Gloria picked up on the second ring and said how did it go before Valentina had said anything, because mothers know, and when Valentina said I got it, Gloria made a sound that was not quite a word but contained everything words contain when they are too small for the feeling. She thought about Santiago. Not with urgency or sadness, with a quality more like wondering. She wondered if he had gotten it. She had told him she thought he would, and she had meant it, but she had also heard the clarity with which he assessed his own readiness, and she trusted that assessment because she had already decided, in 41 minutes, that he was the kind of person whose self-assessments were accurate. She did not know how to find out. She did not have a last name. She had the first name and the face, and an hour and 20 minutes in a cafe 3 years ago, and 41 minutes in a waiting room, and the information that he had carried her notebook down 4 flights of stairs without opening it, and the knowledge that they had sat at opposite ends of the same library table for 6 months on alternate days, and the knowledge that they had been in the same class in adjacent sections of the same room for a full semester, and the knowledge that they had arrived at this building on the same morning for the same reason. She wrote about it that night in the notebook that was now its 8th iteration. Not about him specifically, she was still too close to it, still inside whatever it was, and the things she was closest to always required distance before they became sentences. She wrote about the geometry of near misses, about the way the city contained millions of overlapping orbits that rhymed without touching, about whether the near miss was a form of connection or simply the evidence of its absence. She wrote, "The distance between almost and not is the same as the distance between a word and the space that follows it. Technically nothing. Functionally, everything." She looked at the sentence. Let it stay. Santiago found out from an email. Standard rejection language, professionally courteous. thanking him for his time and portfolio and expressing confidence that he would find the right position for his considerable skills, which was the kind of phrasing that was genuinely well-intentioned and completely useless as comfort. He read it once, closed the laptop, opened it again, and read it once more as if the second reading might offer different information. It didn't. He sat in the apartment on Kale 63 that he shared with Camilo, who was out. Thankfully, because Camilo's method of offering consolation was enthusiastic, and Santiago didn't have the bandwidth for enthusiasm at that particular moment, and looked at the window opposite his desk, which looked not toward the mountains, but toward the building across the street, which was a plain residential building with no architectural argument to make, and yet which had, Santiago had noticed over months of looking at it, one window on the 4th floor that was slightly larger than all the others, as if at some point in the construction, someone had made a different decision for that one opening, and then everything else had been built around it. He looked at that window for a while. Then he opened the personal sketchbook, the one that was not for studio work, the one that contained the buildings without function, and turned to the last drawing. An interior, high walls, a grid of windows, light falling from the west at 4 in the afternoon. He had drawn it the day of the rain, the day of the cafe, 3 years ago. He looked at it. He thought about the waiting room and the stack of forma issues, and the way she had said, "That's what I said," with the completeness of someone who had been waiting to hear that particular argument articulated correctly and had simply been waiting for it to happen. He thought about the library table, the notebook. He thought about an airport, about a waiting room before this one, about a girl reading with a concentration that looked familiar in a way he had no vocabulary for at 18 and still didn't quite have the vocabulary for at 25, but the vocabulary was becoming available, was becoming closer, was forming itself out of what he now knew. He did not know her last name. He knew she would get the job. He knew that the magazine would publish her work, and that the work would be what it needed to be. Honest in the way that good craft is honest. Weighted in the way that only precision can weight things, and he knew this with the same factual, non-vain clarity with which he knew things about himself. Not hope, just observation. He turned to a new page. He began to draw. Not a building this time. Not an interior or a facade or a structure of any kind. He drew a table, a long library table with chairs on both sides, north window, the light from the left. He drew it in detail, in the technical precision that was his natural language, as if by rendering it correctly, he could inhabit it retroactively, could go back to those 6 months of alternate Tuesdays and Thursdays and stay for one extra day. He drew the table. He drew the chairs. He left the second chair from the left end empty. He didn't know what he was doing or why. He was 25 and had just lost a job he wanted and was drawing a library table and a sketchbook at 4 in the afternoon. While the city outside went about its business with the magnificent indifference that cities maintain toward individual disappointments. He closed the sketchbook. He would try again. Not this, perhaps. Not forma yet, not without the 2 years he had said he needed and had not yet had. But something in that direction, some step toward the version of himself that would eventually arrive at the right door at the right moment with the right readiness. He was patient. He had always been patient. What he didn't know was that patience had a limit, that there were doors with clocks on them, moving through time at the same rate he was, and that the question was not only whether he would become ready, but whether he would become ready in time. But 25 is an age at which you don't know that yet. At 25, the future is still a space you can design however you choose, and the errors are recoverable, and the near misses are unfortunate, but not yet the shape of your life. He was 25. He had time, didn't he? Valentina started at Forma on the first Monday of February. Her desk was on the east side of the office, in a corner with 2 windows, one facing the mountains, one facing the street, that gave her the kind of double perspective she had always worked best in. Claudia Reyes showed her around with the direct efficiency of someone who considered orientation a practical matter rather than a ceremonial one, introduced her to the design team and the photography editor and the 2 other staff writers, and then left her at her desk with a stack of back issues and the instruction to read until something made her angry. Because the things that made you angry when reading were always the things you could fix with your own work. Valentina read until something made her angry. Then she started writing. She did not think about the waiting room. She did not think about the conversation or the way he had assessed his own readiness or the clear-eyed precision with which he had looked at his own limitations, which was, though she had not let herself say this clearly, one of the most attractive things she had encountered in a long time. She thought about the work. She had the job. She was here. She had crossed another threshold, had grown into another space that had required growth to enter. The city had not revoked her permission. Somewhere on the other side of the city, in an apartment with a window that faced a building with one off-center window on the 4th floor, a sketchbook sat closed on a desk with a drawing of a library table inside it, and the person who had drawn it was figuring out the next thing, and the next thing after that. They did not know where the other was. They had each other's first names and nothing else. In a city of 10 million people, a first name is almost nothing. Almost. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. The Same Neighborhood. 2018, 29 years old, there is a particular cruelty in proximity. Not the cruelty of distance, which is at least honest about what it is. The measured, mappable space between 2 points that know they are apart. Proximity is crueler because it disguises itself as possibility. It says, look how close. It says, any moment now. It lets you believe that closeness and connection are the same thing, and then it shows you patiently and repeatedly that they are not. They lived 3 blocks apart for 11 months. I counted the blocks. I counted the months. I counted the number of times they were in the same place without knowing it, which was more times than I will tell you here, because some of them I'm still not ready to describe. What I will tell you is this: the city doesn't arrange these things. The city is indifferent. It is large, and it is cold, and it moves at the speed of 10 million separate decisions, and it does not care whether 2 specific people find each other or not. I care. That is the difference. It has always been the difference. Valentina moved to Chapinero Alto on a Saturday in March with 4 boxes of books, 2 boxes of everything else, and the particular lightness of someone who has recently ended something heavy. The relationship with Andres had lasted 3 years past the moment she had first registered the exhaustion, which was, itself a thing she had spent considerable time examining, in the notebooks, in the long, honest conversations with herself that were the closest she came to therapy, which she had considered but not yet pursued with any consistency. 3 years of intermittent clarity and deliberate blindness, of choosing the familiar over the accurate, of telling herself that what she was feeling was atmospheric and temporary when it was neither. It had ended in November, not with a fight or a revelation, but with a conversation so calm and so final it had felt less like a rupture than like a sentence completing itself. All the clauses had been there for years, and eventually the period arrived. She was not devastated. That was the honest answer, and she gave it when people asked. And the fact that she was not devastated told her something she had needed to know. That what she had been protecting for 3 years was not love, but the architecture of love, the structure of it, the routines and the presence and the not being alone, which were real things with real value, but were not the same as the essential thing. And she had known the difference and chosen the structure anyway, and now the structure was gone and she was fine. She was fine and she was 29. And she had decided with a clarity that surprised her in its completeness that she was not going to look for anything for a while. Not because she was wounded. She was careful to know the difference between wounded and simply done. But because she had been in a relationship since she was 20, in one continuous or near continuous state of being with someone, and she had never been properly alone as an adult, and she suspected that the version of herself she most wanted to be was the one that came from spending some real time in her own company without the background noise of a relationship requiring maintenance. She was, in other words, choosing herself, which sounds simple when said plainly and is, in reality, one of the most difficult choices a person makes, because it requires tolerating the discomfort of the absence of what you chose against. And the discomfort is real even when the choice is right. She had found the apartment through a colleague at Forma, 2 bedrooms. 3rd floor, the east-facing window she had come to require in any space she was going to actually inhabit. A small balcony that was too cold to use in winter, but had a view of the rooftops and the distant mountains that she planned to use aggressively in the spring. The building was on a residential street in Chapinero Alto, the kind of block that had been transitioning slowly from family homes to mixed residential and small commercial for a decade without fully committing to either identity, which gave it a pleasant indeterminacy. The bakery from 1987, still beside the design studio that had opened last year, the hardware store beside the artisan cafe, the man who walked his 3 dogs past the window every morning at 7:15 with the regularity of a clock hand. She'd been there 6 weeks when she noticed the bookshop. It was on the corner of her block and the next one, a used bookshop so narrow it appeared to have been inserted into the gap between two. Buildings by someone who believed firmly in the principle that a space between things was a space that needed books. The sign above the door said Libreria El Margen in hand-painted letters that were slightly uneven in a way that felt intentional, and the window display was a tower of books stacked without apparent organizational principle beyond density. And Valentina had been walking past it for 6 weeks without going in because she did not need more books, and she knew herself well enough to know that not needing books was not a sufficient condition for not buying them. She went in on a Thursday afternoon in late April, telling herself she was only looking. The inside of El Margen was what the window had promised: dense, slightly dim, organized in a system that was either deeply personal or completely arbitrary, and smelled of the specific compound of old paper and wood and the faint underlying sweetness of books that have been handled, many times by many different hands. The owner, a woman in her 60s named Petra, who wore her white hair in a braid and appeared to have been sitting at the same stool behind the same counter since sometime in the previous century, looked up when Valentina entered and said nothing, which Valentina recognized immediately as the correct behavior and liked her for. She spent 40 minutes in the shop, which was 39 more than she had intended, and left with 3 books and a 4th she'd found wedged sideways in the Latin American literature section that she hadn't been looking for and couldn't leave behind, which was always how it went, which was exactly why she had avoided the shop for 6 weeks. She came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. By June, Petra recognized her by the sound of the door and had started putting aside things she thought Valentina would want, which was the highest form of intimacy a bookseller can offer a customer, and which Valentina accepted with the gratitude it deserved. She did not know that the shop had another regular, that he came on Saturdays, usually in the morning, and that Petra put aside things for him too, architectural monographs mostly, and books about cities, and occasionally something in the general literature section that Petra described as a hunch, because Petra had been matching people to books for 30 years, and her hunches had the accuracy of something between art and science. She did not know because she did not come on Saturdays. He did not come on Thursdays. I want you to note that I have stopped being surprised by this. I observed it, I recorded it, and I moved on. Some patterns do not require commentary. They only require witness. Santiago had arrived in Chapinero Alto the previous September, which meant he had been there 6 months before Valentina arrived, long enough to have developed the neighborhood routines that make a place feel like yours rather than a place you are staying. The reasons for the apartment were practical. The rent was reasonable for the size. The commute to the firm where he was now working was manageable, and a friend of a friend had mentioned the place at the right moment, which is how most apartments are found in Bogotá, through the specific coincidence of information and meat arriving simultaneously. He had been at the new firm for 2 years. It was a better firm than the previous one, smaller, with a specific interest in adaptive reuse, the practice of taking existing buildings and converting them to new purposes, while preserving the structural and historical elements that gave them character. It was work he found genuinely interesting, because it was architectural argument in the most direct sense. Every decision was a negotiation between what the building had been and what it was becoming, between memory and necessity, between the past claim on space and the present's need for it. He was good at it. Better, in fact, than at the new construction projects he had spent his first years on, because adaptive reuse required a quality of listening to the building, to its history, to the logic embedded in its materials, that was different from the quality of assertion that new construction demanded. Santiago was a better listener than he was an asserter. He had always known this. It had taken him a few years to understand it as a professional strength, rather than a personal limitation. He was also, as he had told himself he needed to be when he was 25, 2 years further along. Not quite at the version of himself he had been aiming at then. He suspected that version was permanently receding, which was either discouraging or simply the definition of growth, but substantially closer. He had published 3 pieces, designed a small cultural space among Candelaria that had been written about in 2 architectural journals, and developed a specific vocabulary for the kind of work he wanted to do that he had not had at 25, and that made all the difference. He was also in the September of the previous year in a relationship that was ending. Her name was Mariana. She was a landscape architect, smart and warm, with a specific quality of attention for the natural world that Santiago had found beautiful and that he had tried to learn from without being fully able to inhabit. They had been together for 2 years, and the ending had been approaching for the last 7 months of those 2 years in the way that some endings approach, visibly, undeniably, with a sadness that had nothing to do with fault and everything to do with the specific shape of 2 people who were genuinely good for each other in some ways and genuinely not right for each other in the ways that turned out to matter most. They were still together in September. Still together when he moved to Chapinero Alto. Still together with the exhausted tenderness of 2 people who care for each other and are running out of reasons to continue. When Valentina moved in 3 blocks away in March, the ending came in May. It came, as these things usually did, not with drama but with honesty, a conversation in which they both said what they had been not saying for months, and the relief of saying it was mixed with the grief of what the saying meant. And they parted with a respect for each other that was genuine, and that both of them knew was more than most people got. Santiago sat in his apartment on the evening after that conversation and felt, in the particular silence of a space that has recently been reconfigured by someone's departure, not physically, Mariana hadn't lived there, but atmospherically, in the specific way that the end of a relationship changes the temperature of a room, the weight of what had happened. He was 29, he was alone. He was, if he was honest, and he was always honest. It was the thing most central to him, relieved in a way that the sadness didn't fully cover, which was its own kind of information about what their relationship had been. He went for a walk. The bakery was called La Mechanica, a name that had no apparent relationship to baked goods, but which the owner, a large man named Gonzalo, who had the bearing of someone who had baked at 5 in the morning for 30 years and found it entirely satisfactory, explained when asked by saying that his grandfather had been a mechanic and the shop had been a garage before it was a bakery, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The bread was excellent. The coffee was better than most coffee in most cafes, which was Gonzalo's personal point of pride. Valentina had found it her first week in the neighborhood and had made it a Wednesday morning ritual. 1 coffee, 1 pan de bono, the corner table if it was available, 45 minutes before work. Santiago had found it 6 months earlier and had made it a Monday morning ritual. 1 coffee, 1 almojábana, standing at the counter rather than sitting, because he tended to pace while he thought, and standing was the closest available approximation. Monday and Wednesday, Gonzalo knew both of them, in the way that bakery owners know their regulars. By order, by time of arrival, by the specific quality of their presence. One who sat, one who stood, one who read, one who drew in a small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. Both of whom tipped generously and said thank you with the kind of genuine attention that most people reserve for more significant transactions. Once, in July, Gonzalo mentioned to Valentina on a Wednesday, while making her coffee, that he had a customer who had recently recommended a book she might like, a Colombian architect who had written about Bogotá's informal urbanism in a way that Gonzalo, who was not a reader of books about architecture, but was a reader of books about the city he had lived in his whole life, had found remarkable. What's the book? Valentina asked. Gonzalo told her the title. She knew it, had assigned it in a seminar discussion, actually. Had argued about it. Do you know who recommended it? She asked, more from journalistic habit than expectation. A young man who comes on Mondays, architect, very quiet, draws in a little notebook while he drinks his coffee. Valentina looked at Gonzalo. "That's specific," she said. "He's been coming for months. You notice people when they come regularly." She filed this in the way she filed things, with attention, without immediate action, into that unmarked archive of details that her mind kept for reasons it didn't always explain. She did not ask his name. Gonzalo did not volunteer it. Some information arrives when it's ready and not before, and there is nothing to be done about the timing. The gym was on the second floor of a building on Kale 62, reachable by either of two routes from either of their apartments, one slightly shorter, one slightly more pleasant, and each of them had chosen the pleasant one, independently and for the same reason, which was that the pleasant route went past a small park with 4 eucalyptus trees that smelled remarkable in the rain. They had both joined in June. The gym was not large, perhaps 40 people in the evening rush, 20 in the morning, with the specific worn-in quality of a space that had been used consistently for years and had the comfort of accumulated purpose. The equipment was functional, if not modern. The windows on the east side were large and let in the morning light at an angle that made early morning attendance feel like less of an imposition than it otherwise might. Valentina went on Tuesday and Thursday evenings between 7 and 8:30, because the workday at Forma reliably ran long and the evening was the only hour with a consistent boundary. Santiago went on Monday and Wednesday evenings and Saturday mornings, Tuesday and Thursday, Monday and Wednesday. I'm going to stop explaining this pattern. You understand it by now. The city was doing what cities do, which is distribute 10 million people across a grid and let the probabilities work, and the probabilities were working, and the probabilities were wrong. There was one exception. In the second week of August, a Tuesday evening, the electricity in Santiago's block went out at 6:15. A transformer problem that the utility company resolved in 4 hours, and rather than sit in his apartment in the dark, he went to the gym, arriving at 7:10. Valentina was there. Had been there since 7. He did not know her, she did not know him. They were in the same room for 50 minutes. Separated by the particular kind of anonymity that gyms provide, everyone in their own physical effort. The social contract of the space being one of mutual non-intrusion, and neither of them looked at the other with any recognition. 50 minutes. I counted. Then she left at 7:50, and he stayed until 8:30, and the moment closed as they all did, quietly without sound. The neighbor's name was Carmen. She was 54, had lived in the building on the corner for 22 years. Had an opinion about everything within a 6-block radius, and a network of acquaintances that she maintained with a dedication, of someone who understood that community was not an accident, but a practice. She knew Gonzalo from the bakery, Petra from the bookshop, the man with the 3 dogs by first and last name, the schedule of the garbage truck, the hours of every small business on the block, and the names and circumstances of most of the people who had moved in or out of the neighborhood in the past decade. She had met Valentina in April in the stairwell of a building 2 doors down where they were both visiting different people at a small gathering, and had decided in the first 10 minutes that Valentina was exactly the kind of person who should know exactly the kind of people Carmen knew. She had met Santiago the previous October through a mutual acquaintance at an event about urban housing, and had decided the same thing about him in roughly the same amount of time. They were, Carmen had determined by early summer, people who should know each other. She was not a romantic matchmaker, or not primarily, but a social one. A person who believed that the right connections between people were productive in the way that good architecture was productive, that they created something neither person could have built alone. She had seen Santiago's work described in a journal and thought of Valentina's magazine. She had read one of Valentina's pieces about urban space and thought of Santiago's adaptive reuse projects. The overlap was precise enough to be interesting. She decided to invite them both to dinner. She planned the dinner for the last Friday of August. She told Santiago in early August, when she ran into him at El Margan on a Saturday morning. He came regularly. She had noticed, and he said yes, he'd be glad to come. She liked that he didn't qualify the yes with conditions or alternatives. She told Valentina the following Wednesday at the bakery where they occasionally overlapped in the morning, and Valentina said yes with the same unconditioned directness. Carmen wrote them both into her calendar for the last Friday of August and felt the particular satisfaction of someone who has arranged a thing she believes in. The last Friday of August at 4:15 in the afternoon, Valentina received a call from her mother. Gloria Ruiz had been having a difficult month, a health matter that was not. The doctors had serious, but that was not nothing either. The kind of ambiguous medical situation that sits in the category of watchful waiting and requires exactly the kind of patience that the people who love the patient find most difficult to maintain. Valentina had been calling more frequently, writing longer letters, finding reasons to make the 9-hour drive to Moco on weekends when her schedule allowed, which it did not allow as often as she would have liked. The call that afternoon was not alarming. It was simply her mother's voice with the specific texture it had when something was more difficult than Gloria wanted to admit, and Valentina heard that texture the way she'd been hearing it for 29 years, as clearly as if it were a note she had perfect pitch for. She called Carmen at 5. "I'm so sorry," she said. "Something's come up with my mother. I don't think I can come tonight." Carmen said the right things. Of course, family first, they would reschedule. She hoped everything was all right, and that all of them, and hung up and looked at the dinner she had been preparing since 2 in the afternoon and felt the specific frustration of arrangements that disassemble at the last moment, which was a frustration she was well acquainted with and had long since accepted as the necessary risk of being someone who made arrangements. She considered calling Santiago to cancel. She decided not to, because the food was made and Santiago was genuinely good company, and the other guests, 3 friends from the neighborhood, would still be there, and there was no particular reason to dismantle the whole evening because one person couldn't come. Santiago arrived at 7:30 with a bottle of wine and his usual quality of attentive quiet and had a good evening. And at some point, Carmen mentioned that she had another guest who had to cancel at the last minute, a journalist who lived 2 blocks over who wrote for Forma. Had he heard of it? He had, he said, and something moved in his expression that Carmen noticed but didn't probe, because Carmen was socially skilled enough to know the difference between information she should follow and information she should let develop at its own pace. She would reschedule, she told him. She would make sure they met. She said this with the confidence of someone who has successfully arranged many things and has no reason to doubt this particular arrangement. She did not know, because there was no way for her to know that she had 2 weeks. Santiago had been offered a project in Lisbon. It had come through a contact at an international architecture conference in July, a Portuguese firm doing a significant adaptive reuse project, a 19th century industrial complex being converted to a mixed cultural and residential space. The kind of project that was exactly the work he had been building toward, precisely at the scale and complexity that would constitute the 2 more years he had told himself he needed. The firm had seen his La Candelaria project in the journal publications and had made the offer with a specificity that told him they had done their research and that the offer was genuine. He had said he needed 2 weeks to decide. He had spent those 2 weeks deciding in the way he made most significant decisions, not with lists or deliberate analysis, but by noticing what he felt when he moved toward the idea versus away from it, which was a method that looked like intuition from the outside and felt like geometry from the inside, a spatial sense of where the right answer was located, where the structure held. The structure held toward Lisbon. It was not easy. He had been in Bogotá his whole life, had the specific attachment to a city that comes from knowing it in your body, its rhythms, its altitudes, its ways of being cold and bright and unpredictable in the same hour. He had the firm he was at in Canillo and Isabella and Almargen and La Mecanica and the park with the eucalyptus trees. He had, in Chapinero Alto, built something that felt like a life rather than an arrangement, and leaving it required a grief he permitted himself to acknowledge before putting it in the appropriate place. He said yes in the 2nd week of September. The departure date was set for the 1st of October. The storm arrived on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of September. Not the gentle, deliberate rain that Bogotá managed most days as a kind of atmospheric policy, but the other kind, the kind that arrives without negotiation, that turns the streets into shallow rivers and drives and fills the doorways of closed shops with people who had not checked the forecast and were now reassessing their relationship with preparation. Valentina had been at Forma late, a deadline, a piece about a housing project in the periphery that she'd been revising all week, and that had, finally come together that afternoon with the specific satisfaction of a thing that has been fought for and won. She left the office at 7:30, walked the 2 blocks to the Transmilenio station under a sky that was performing structural integrity until the moment she stepped outside the station at Chapinero, at which point it stopped performing. She ran. Not far. She was 4 blocks from home, and running in Bogota rain is an approximately cosmetic activity since the rain is capable of soaking you through faster than any reasonable running pace can outpace it, but she ran anyway, with her bag held over her head in the gesture that is both useless and instinctive. The gesture that means, I know this isn't working, but I am required to try. She turned onto her street and found that the building she had been aiming for, the narrow one between the laundromat and the stationery shop, with a deep recessed entrance that offered real shelter, already had someone standing in it. She didn't stop to assess. She simply went in because the rain was the kind of rain that suspends normal social calculation and replaces it with the basic physics of shelter. She pressed back against the metal door beside him, and they both looked out at the street where the water was running in a sheet off the awning above. Sorry, she said, because she had arrived suddenly and closely. There's room, he said. There was. The entrance was a full meter deep and wide enough for 2 people without contact, which was the minimum required for the situation to be socially uncomplicated. They stood and looked at the rain. He had been heading home from El Margen, where he had spent the late afternoon in the way he sometimes spent Saturday afternoons. Petra had put aside 2 things for him: a monograph on Portuguese vernacular architecture that he had specifically been looking for, and that arriving at this particular moment felt like the city making a comment, and a slim novel that Petra described only as a hunch, which he had learned to trust. He had stayed longer than he intended, talking to Petra about the Lisbon project, which Petra received with the gravity it deserved. She took people's departures seriously, which was one of the reasons her customers told her things. He had left at 7:25 and made it 1 block before the sky changed its mind. He had ducked into the entrance without looking at it architecturally, which was itself notable. He usually looked at everything architecturally, but there are conditions under which the body's priorities override the mind's habits, and the Bogota rain in full expression was one of them. He stood in the entrance and looked at the rain and thought about Lisbon with the specific quality of thought that comes when a decision has been made and thinking is no longer deliberative, but simply the mind processing the reality of what is coming. Then the woman arrived, quickly and slightly breathless, and said sorry. He said there's room because there was. They stood beside each other, not close, the meter of depth allowing reasonable distance, and looked at the rain. He registered. Dark jacket, wet hair, a bag held against her chest. The quality of someone who is slightly out of breath, not from exertion, but from the specific adrenaline of being caught by weather. He did not look at her face directly. In the etiquette of shared doorway sheltering, you looked at the rain. She registered. Dark jacket, a book in a bag. She could see the corner of it. The quality of someone who had been somewhere specific and was returning from it. A subtle quality in the stillness beside her that was not unfriendly, but simply self-contained. They stood in silence for 10 minutes. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have been placed in proximity by circumstance and have independently reached the same assessment, that the rain requires patience, that patience is better maintained in quiet, that the stranger beside you is not an intrusion, but simply another person also waiting, which is a form of solidarity even when it goes unnamed. At some point, Valentina said to the rain, "Do you think it's going to let up?" He looked at the sky with the evaluative attention he brought to structural assessments. "In about 10 minutes, he said. "The heavy part is past. This is the trailing edge." She looked at the sky herself, trying to see what he was seeing. How can you tell? The sound changes. The heavy rain has a uniformity to it. When it starts to break up, you get irregular intervals. You can hear the gaps beginning. She listened. He was right. There were gaps, not visual gaps in the curtain of water, not yet, but acoustic ones. Brief interruptions in the continuous percussion of rain on awning and pavement. "That's a very precise way of listening," she said. "It's the architecture," he said. "Or it's just paying attention. Or it's the same thing." She turned her head and looked at him then for the first time directly, and he turned at the same moment, both responding to the same slight shift in the quality of the exchange, both registering that something had moved from standard shared shelter interaction into something with a different texture. They looked at each other. 2 seconds. There was no recognition. There was, I want to be exact about this, because it matters, something that was not recognition but was adjacent to it. A quality of the look that contained a question neither of them could have articulated. A sense that this face was not entirely foreign in some way that had nothing to do with having actually met, which they had multiple times in ways neither of them retained. The body's record of proximity, perhaps. The accumulated weight of 6 years of almost encounters expressing itself in a 2-second look as something less than recognition and more than the neutral assessment of a stranger. Neither of them said anything about it. What he said was, "I think you're right that it's clearing." What she said was, "I live 2 blocks from here." What he said was, "I'm on Kale 62. What she said was, "I'm on 63. 1 block parallel." They both absorbed this information with a brief mutual acknowledgement of neighbors, the mild social fact of sharing a neighborhood, which is meaningful enough to mention and not meaningful enough to require development. Then the rain thinned as he had predicted, and she said, "I think I can make it." He said, "Go quickly before the next band comes through." She pulled her jacket tighter, adjusted her bag, and stepped out from under the awning into the diminished rain. "Thank you," she said from the sidewalk. For what exactly, she didn't specify. The shelter had been circumstantial, not offered. But the thanks felt right anyway, and he received it without questioning it. She walked quickly toward her block and was gone before the next band arrived, which he had correctly predicted would come in approximately 4 minutes. He stood in the entrance for those 4 minutes, and then walked the remaining block and a half to his building in the trailing rain. With the book, Petra had set aside in his bag and the monograph on Portuguese vernacular architecture, and a week and a half before Lisbon. He thought about her, walking home. Not specifically, he didn't have the name or the context, or the texture of a real person. Only the impression of the last 20 minutes. A woman who had listened for the gaps in the rain and heard them, who had understood the observation about precision and paying attention, who had thanked him for shelter that hadn't bennies to offer. The thought was brief and gentle, the kind of thought that comes when you have recently been reminded that the world contains other people who are interesting, that the city is full of them, that the particular isolation of a decision made, Lisbon, departure, the reconfiguration of a life, does not mean the city stops containing interesting people, only that you are about to leave them for a while. She thought about him, walking home. The same kind of thought, brief, gentle, the impression of someone who knew how rain worked from the inside, who had described precision and attention as possibly the same thing, in a way that resonated with something she had said before in some other context she couldn't immediately place. She put it aside. She was tired and she was damp, and she had a piece to finish in the morning and a phone call to make to her mother in the evening, and the week had been full and the month had been full, and being alone and choosing it were not always the same experience, when the loneliness arrived as a cold weight in a shared doorway, after a 10-minute silence that had been more comfortable than some conversations she'd had with people she knew. She put it aside. Carmen rescheduled the dinner for the following Friday. She called Santiago on Monday. He answered on the second ring and told her he was sorry, but he would be leaving for Lisbon the following week. The project had finalized. The date had been confirmed. His flight was on Thursday. He was genuinely sorry about the dinner, about not meeting the journalist he'd heard about, but the timing was what it was. Carmen held the phone and felt the specific sensation of an arrangement she had believed in dismantling for the second time. She said the right things. Congratulations. What an incredible opportunity, of course. These things happen. She meant all of them. She called Valentina on Tuesday. "I was going to reschedule the dinner," she said. "But Santiago, the architect I wanted you to meet, is leaving for Lisbon on Thursday." Valentina received this with the mild and uncomplicated disappointment of a missed social engagement. "That's a shame," she said. "He's doing remarkable work, adaptive reuse. His project in La Candelaria, I know that project," Valentina said. We covered it in Forma 2 years ago. Excellent piece. I didn't write it, but I edited it. Carmen was quiet for a moment. You edited a piece about his work, she said. I didn't know it was his when you mentioned him the first time. What's his last name? Mora. Santiago Mora. Valentina said nothing for a moment. Are you all right? Asked Carmen. Yes. A pause. I've almost met him before. Somewhere else. I think. What do you mean? Nothing specific. Just, she stopped. The sentence had too many directions and none of them were quick. It's nothing. Is there no way to arrange something before Thursday? He leaves Thursday morning. I could try for Wednesday evening, but it would be very last minute and I couldn't guarantee. Don't worry, Valentina said. Some other time. When he's back, he'll be in Lisbon for 2 years, Carmen said. Another pause. Some other time then, Valentina said. Wednesday evening. Santiago walked his usual route to El Margen for the last time, to say goodbye to Petra and leave a stack of books he couldn't take with him and wouldn't leave in the apartment, which he had given up, asking Petra to donate them or sell them as she saw fit, which Petra agreed to with the unsentimental practicality of someone who had managed more books than most people had seen and had no particular feelings about their materiality. You'll come back, Petra said. Of course. 2 years is a long time. And no time at all, he said, which was something he had been thinking and hadn't said out loud yet, and the fact of saying it made it more real and less frightening simultaneously. Petra gave him the novel she had pressed on him the previous week, The Hunch, which he had not yet read. For the plane, she said. He put it in his jacket pocket, shook her hand, which was their usual goodbye, and went back into the street where the September evening was cool and clear, the earlier week's storms having exhausted themselves. The sky above the rooftops of Chapinero, a dark blue that was almost the color of a particular notebook he had once carried down 4 flights of stairs without opening. He walked home along the route that went past the park with the 4 eucalyptus trees and the building with the entrance where he had stood in the rain last Thursday. He walked slowly, the way you walk through a place you are committing to memory. Valentina was on her balcony. She was there because the evening was clear in a way that demanded to be observed rather than missed, and because the rooftops and the distant mountains and the last light were worth the cold, and because she had a glass of wine and a book and nowhere to be, which was the combination of conditions under which she did her best thinking. She did not see him. He was on the opposite sidewalk, 3 stories below her line of sight, walking with the slightly inward quality of someone who is somewhere in their own head. He did not see her. She was 3 floors up, and the balcony was small, and the evening light came from the west, putting her side of the building in shadow. He walked past. She turned a page of the notebook. The eucalyptus trees in the park 2 blocks away smelled, in the clear September evening, of something between medicine and ceremony. That particular eucalyptus quality that is simultaneously practical and holy, that has been used for both purposes across so many cultures that the scent itself seems to carry the weight of human need. She wrote a sentence about it. He turned the corner. He left on Thursday morning at 5:30. The airport was cold and dark and exactly as it had been the last time and the time before that, because airports are one of the few human spaces that remain fundamentally themselves across decades, that absorb all the traffic of departure and arrival and change their carpets, and their signage but keep the essential quality of what they are, the place between places, the margin between here and there, the space where leaving happens. He sat in the waiting area with his carry-on and his sketchbooks and Petra's novel and thought about the building in Lisbon, about the 19th century walls he would be working with, about the way a structure that has been used for one thing for 150 years holds that use in its materials, in the compression of its stones and the oxidation of its metals, and how the work of adaptive reuse was really a form of translation, making the building say something new in its own original language. He was excited. He was also, in the specific way of departures, sad. The good kind of sad, the kind that confirms you have built something real in the place you are leaving. He thought about Chapinero, about La Mechanica and El Margen and the park with the eucalyptus trees, about Carmen's dinner that hadn't happened twice. about the journalist he had never met who had edited a piece about his work without knowing it was his. He thought about the woman in the rain, briefly, gently, the way you think about something that belongs to the city you are leaving rather than the city you are going to. Then his flight was called. He stood, gathered his things, joined the line. I watched him go. I have watched many departures, and I do not have a hierarchy of the ones I grieve more than others. That would be a kind of editorializing. That is not my role. But I will tell you that this one had a particular quality of weight, because this was the first time one of them was leaving the country, the first time the geography of the near miss was expanding beyond the city, and because I knew what was coming in the years ahead, and the knowing made the departure heavier than any individual departure should be. He walked through the gate. I stayed. In Chapinero Alto, 3 blocks from where he had been, Valentina slept through her alarm for the first time in months and woke at 7:30 to a clear Thursday morning. Made coffee, stood on the balcony in the cold with the mountains visible all the way to the north, and felt, for no reason she could locate, a quality of absence that was not her own. A sense that something had left the radius of her life without her knowledge, which was a perception so abstract, she dismissed it almost immediately, filing it in the same unlabeled archive where she kept the things that didn't fit. She went to work, she wrote. The neighborhood continued without him, the way neighborhoods do. The bakery opened, Gonzalo made coffee. The man walked his 3 dogs past the window at 7:15. The eucalyptus trees in the park did not notice the difference. Only Petra noticed, and Carmen, and the particular ghost that every regular presence leaves in a space when it is consistently absent. The faint impression of a person in the places they no longer occupy, which fades in time and leaves only the shape of the things that remain. The apartment on Kale 62 was rented to someone else in November. The table at El Margan where he had sat on Saturdays went to other people, as tables do. The route past the park was walked by other people, and the eucalyptus trees smelled of ceremony for them too, and none of them knew what had been carried past them on a Thursday morning in September 11 months. He had been 3 blocks away for 11 months. She had been 3 blocks away for 6. The distance between them the whole time was less than it took to walk to the park and back. And yet, end of Chapter 4. Chapter 5, One Whole Night, 2022, 33 years old. I've been waiting to tell you this chapter. Not because it is the easiest, it is not the easiest. It is, in some ways, the most difficult, because it is the one in which everything goes right and everything goes wrong simultaneously. And the distance between those two things is the distance between saying a true thing and not saying it, which is sometimes the distance between a person and the rest of their life. But I have been waiting because this is the chapter where they finally see each other. Really see each other. And after everything I have carried, the airport, the rain, the library, the cafe, the waiting room, the doorway, the 3 blocks, the 11 months, I need you to understand what it meant to watch it happen. It meant everything. It also wasn't enough. That is a part that is hardest to carry. The city of Medellin in October has a quality of light that Bogota, with its high-altitude severity, does not permit itself. It is lower, warmer, more golden in the afternoons. A city that was rebuilt from violence into something that still surprises itself with its own beauty. That looks at its own transformation with the specific vertigo of someone who survived something they weren't supposed to survive and is still not entirely sure what to do with the fact of being alive. The Forma Urbana Festival had been running for 6 years. It occupied 3 days in the second week of October, spread across 4 venues in the city center and in the renovated industrial district to the east. A gathering of architects, urban planners, journalists, photographers, and the particular species of person who existed at the intersection of all of those things, who found in the built environment a language for talking about everything else. There were talks and panels and exhibitions and the informal conversations that happened between all of those things, which were usually the most important conversations of the 3 days. Valentina had been coming since the 2nd year. She had covered it for Forma twice and attended personally once. And this year, she was speaking on a panel about the narrative of informal urbanism, how the city tells its own story through the unplanned, the provisional, the improvised structures that official architecture ignores, and that are in fact the most honest record of how people actually live. She had arrived the previous evening. Her panel was Saturday afternoon. She had all of Friday and Saturday morning for the exhibitions and the conversations and the particular pleasure of being in a professional context that felt like home, where the people around her were thinking about the same questions she thought about, and the quality of the thinking was high enough to be interesting rather than merely professional. She was 33. The 4 years since Chapanero had been, by most measures, good ones. She had published her first book, a collection of long-form pieces about Bogotá's peripheral neighborhoods, built around the central argument that the edges of a city contain its most honest self-portrait, to the kind of reception that was not spectacular but was serious, the kind that builds slowly and lasts. She had been offered a senior editor position at Forma and had taken it with the understanding that she would keep writing, which Claudia Reyes had agreed to because Claudia Reyes was exactly the kind of editor who understood that the best editors were writers who had not stopped. She had traveled for work to Medellin repeatedly, to Cartagena, twice to Mexico City, once to Buenos Aires, and had found in each city a version of the question she was always asking, which was, what does the way we build things say about the way we think we deserve to live? She was alone and had been since Andres, and had made peace with this in stages that she did not minimize or accelerate. The first year had been the good solitude, the productive kind she had chosen. The second year had been harder, the loneliness arriving not as a crisis, but as a low, persistent frequency, the background note of a life that had room in it that was not being filled. The third and fourth year she had dated. 2 people, briefly, both good people with whom something had been present, but not the right thing. And she ended both with more clarity and less guilt than she had managed at 21, which she counted as progress. She was 33 and she was good at her life, and she was also in the honest interior account she kept, still waiting for something she could not entirely name. She did not arrive at the festival thinking about this. She arrived thinking about her panel, about the exhibition she wanted to see that morning, about the conversation she had arranged over breakfast with a photographer whose work she had been following for 2 years. She was not thinking about near misses or airports or rain or library tables. She was not thinking about a first name she'd been carrying for 15 years without a face she could keep. She was not thinking about any of that. And then she walked into the main exhibition hall of the Forma Urbana Festival at 10:15 on a Friday morning in October and saw, across the room, a man standing in front of a large photographic print of an adaptive reuse project, 19th century industrial walls, new structural insertions of glass and steel. The conversation between materials that was the argument of the work, studying it with a quality of attention she recognized before she recognized anything else about him. Not the face, not yet. The stillness. Santiago had come back from Lisbon in early 2021. The 2 years had been 3. The project had extended, as significant projects do, and then extended again. And he had let it extend because the work was the best work he had done, and because Lisbon had given him something he had not expected. The experience of being foreign, of reading a city in a language that was not his native language, of having to understand a place from the outside before he could understand it from the inside, which had changed the way he understood Bogotá in retrospect, made him see it with a double vision of someone who has been away long enough to return as a partial stranger. He had come back to a city that had continued without him, which cities do, which was the thing about cities. Their magnificent indifference to the comings and goings of any individual life, and had spent the first months relearning it, reestablishing the particular fluency of inhabiting a place that had been yours and was yours again, and was also somehow different, which was both the city changing and him changing, and the difference between the two being impossible to calculate precisely. He had started his own small firm. Just him and 2 others to start, Isabella, who had been doing significant work in housing design and who had been talking about partnership for years, and a younger architect named Philippe, whose technical skills were exceptional and whose curiosity was of the right kind, the kind that generated better work rather than longer meetings. They had a name, Trema, which meant both weft and plot, the double meaning deliberate, and a specific position in the field. Adaptive reuse and what Santiago described as inhabited history, the practice of making buildings that acknowledged everything they had been as a condition of becoming what they needed to be. The work was good. The firm was young enough to be energized by difficulty and experienced enough not to be destroyed by it. He was building in every sense he understood the word to have. He was also alone in the factual sense, and had been since Mariana, and had not rushed to change this because rushing had never been his way, and because the Lisbon years had given him, among other things, a sharper sense of what he was actually looking for, which made the not finding less like absence and more like specific searching. He was 33. He had come to Forma Urbana because one of his projects, a converted textile factory in Bogotá's San Victorino district, now a mixed-use cultural and residential building, was in the main exhibition. And because the panel programming was excellent, and because Isabella had told him flatly that he needed to stop working on weekends, and this was a sanctioned alternative that she was personally requiring him to take. He had arrived Thursday evening. He had walked the city on Thursday night the way he always walked unfamiliar cities, without direction, reading them, letting them tell him what they were. Medellin had told him, rebuilt, resilient, complicated, still in the middle of its own story and aware of it. Friday morning, he went to the main exhibition hall to see the other work, not his own, which he had looked at enough, but the rest, the conversation he was in without always being able to see it from the outside. He was standing in front of a photographic series from a Peruvian firm when he became aware, in the peripheral and precognitive way of someone whose attention is trained, of someone entering the room. He did not look up immediately. Then he did. She was crossing the room with the directness she brought to all physical movement, not hurried, not casual, purposeful, with a canvas bag on her shoulder and a program folded in one hand and the focused open expression of someone who has arrived at a place they were looking forward to arriving at. She was wearing dark clothes, her hair up, and she was looking toward the far wall where the large format prints were hung, which meant her gaze was passing through the space rather than examining it, and she had not yet looked at him. He looked at her. He had the sensation, not recognition, not yet, but the same sensation he had had in the rain. In the doorway on the street in Chapinero 4 years ago, a quality of not quite foreignness, a face that was not familiar and yet not entirely strange, that registered in some part of his perception as something other than a new thing. He looked at her for 3 seconds before she turned her head and their eyes met across the room. She stopped. Not a dramatic stop, a small one, the involuntary interruption of forward motion that happens when something in the visual field demands a recalibration. She looked at him. He looked at her. The distance between them was approximately 12 meters, which I measured, and which meant they were too far for detail but close enough for the essential thing, which was the specific quality of recognition that does not come from memory but from something older than memory. Something the body keeps in a place the mind cannot access. She crossed the room. Not toward him specifically, or not only toward him, not with declared intention, but in his direction, because his direction was also the direction of the large format prints, and she was moving toward those. But the trajectory was his direction, and she walked it, and when she arrived at the wall, she was standing next to him. She looked at the print he had been looking at. He looked at it with her. 15 seconds of shared attention to the same image. The industrial walls, the glass insertion, the conversation between what had been and what was. The way the old masonry reads against the new steel, she said, not to him exactly, but not to the room either, to the thought she was having half aloud. It's the whole argument, he said. The building is saying, I know what I was. I'm not pretending to be something I wasn't. I'm just becoming what I need to be. She turned and looked at him. He turned and looked at her. And I want to tell you about this moment. The second moment of direct eye contact, closer now, detail available now, because it was different from the first one across the room. The first one had been the body's question. This one was the mind's beginning of an answer. That's a very specific way of describing it, she said. It's the only accurate one, he said. A pause. Are you an architect? She asked. Yes, you? Journalist. Forma magazine. He went still in the way he went still when something required reorientation. Forma, he said. Do you know it? I applied for a job there in 2014, he said. I didn't get it. She looked at him. I got that job in 2014, she said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of two people beginning to compute something, beginning to run the numbers on a coincidence that is starting to look like it might not be one. What's your name? She asked. Santiago Mora. She looked at him for a long moment. Valentina Ruiz, she said. His expression did not change dramatically. What changed was subtler. A quality of attention, a slight adjustment of focus. The way a person looks when something they have been holding loosely suddenly requires a tighter grip. The journalist, he said. Carmen mentioned you in Chapinero. In 2018, Carmen, she repeated. She was trying to arrange a dinner. That never happened. Twice, she said. I was leaving for Lisbon. I know. She told me. They looked at each other. You edited a piece about my La Candelaria project, he said. Without knowing it was yours. I know, I found out later. From the journal that also covered it. And before that, she said, slowly, there was a waiting room. On the 12th floor of a building on Kale 93, in January of 2014, he did not look away. 41 minutes, he said. You left before I came out. I came back. You were already gone. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't know you came back, she said. I know, there was no way for you to know. Another silence. Both of them were doing the same thing, looking at each other and simultaneously looking backward through time, searching the architecture of their separate lives for the structural joints, the places where the walls had almost touched. There was a cafe, she said, on Carrera Septima. In the rain, 2010, he looked at her. That was you, he said. It was not a question. He had known since she said her name, had been assembling it since the waiting room, but the cafe confirmed it with a specificity that shifted the conversation from computation to something else entirely. You turned the sketchbook around without being asked, she said. You asked what the building was for. You said it was for nothing. That without a function, it had to justify itself through form alone. You said you did the same thing with writing. You said sometimes too. They were looking at each other with the specific intensity of people who are discovering retroactively that they have been part of the same story, which is a different kind of intensity from any other because it is simultaneously about the present and about the past, about what is happening now and about the weight of everything that happened before. There was a library, she said. 3rd floor, he said. The long table with the north window. I sat at the second chair from the left. I sat on the right side. We were never there on the same day, for 6 months. For 6 months. A pause in which they both absorbed this. The 6 months, the alternate days, the same table at opposite ends. The notebook carried down 4 flights of stairs by hands that didn't know what they were carrying. You carried my notebook to the circulation desk, she said. I didn't open it. I know. The librarian told me someone from the architecture school had brought it down. You wrote in it, he said. Later, that night, I think, something about near misses. She looked at him. How do you know that? I don't, I'm guessing. Because if I had found a notebook that turned out to belong to someone I kept almost meeting, the first thing I would do when I got it back is write in it. She looked at him for a long moment. I wrote about the geometry of near misses, she said. About whether they were a form of connection or simply evidence of its absence. Which did you conclude? She considered. I didn't. I left it open. The honest answer, the only answer. They walked out of the exhibition hall at 11:45. Not because they had decided to, neither of them made a decision, exactly. They moved together the way water moves, which is not a decision but a response to the shape of the space. The space in this case being the conversation they were inside, which had a direction and a momentum that both of them simply followed. They walked through the festival grounds, past other exhibitions, past the queue for the first panel of the morning, past the outdoor installation in the courtyard that was a series of transparent planes representing the layers of a city's history at a single point, visible simultaneously, each era coexisting with the others in the same space, which was either a commentary on architectural time or a description of what was happening between the two people walking past it, or both. When I was 18, Valentina said, I flew from Mocha to Bogota for the first time. I had a connection at El Dorado. I sat in the waiting area for almost 5 hours. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "What date?" he said. "January 15th, 2007. He was quiet for a moment that had the quality of someone recalculating something fundamental. "I was at El Dorado that day," he said, "coming back from Cartagena with my family. I sat in the same waiting area for an hour and 40 minutes. She looked at him. I heard a laugh, she said. Twice. A man on the phone laughing. I couldn't see his face. I was reading 100 Years of Solitude. He closed his eyes for a single second. When he opened them, his expression had the quality of someone who has been shown something they have been trying to see for a long time. I saw a girl reading, he said. At the other side of the waiting area, green suitcase between her legs. I walked toward her. There was an announcement for a flight to Florencia, and I looked away for 2 seconds, and when I looked back, she was gone. Valentina looked at him with everything she had, with the full attention that was her most essential quality, the one her mother had recognized before she could read and her professors had built on and her editors had relied on, and that had always been, at its core, less a professional skill than a form of love, the love of paying enough attention to a thing to actually see it. She looked at him and understood that she was looking at the laugh she had heard in the airport when she was 18, and the hand that had turned a sketchbook without being asked, and the hand that had carried a notebook down 4 flights of stairs, and the man in the doorway who had told her to listen for the gaps in the rain, and all of the almost encounters, all of the almost meetings, all of the moments in which the city had arranged the proximity and something. Timing, circumstance, a flight announcement, a boyfriend arriving, a departure to Lisbon had converted the proximity into a near miss. She was looking at all of that in a single face, at 33 on a Friday morning in October in Medellin, and the feeling that moved through her was large and complex and not entirely comfortable, because it was the feeling of something that had been arriving for a very long time finally arriving. And things that have been arriving for a long time have weight when they land. 15 years, she said. Almost exactly. We've been in the same places for 15 years, without knowing. Without knowing, she agreed. A pause. Do you believe in fate? She asked. Not casually, with genuine curiosity, with the willingness to receive whatever answer was honest. He thought about it with the seriousness she'd already remembered, the quality of actually thinking before answering, of treating the question with the respect of real consideration. I believe in structure, he said. I believe that things have an underlying logic that isn't always visible until you're far enough back to see the whole. Whether that's fate or whether it's pattern recognition depends on whether you think the structure was designed, or whether it just is. Pause. I haven't decided. I think, she said slowly, that the fate question is the wrong question. The question I keep coming back to is, what were the decisions, yours and mine? The ones that put us in the same places and the ones that kept us from meeting in them. He looked at her. I walked toward you in the airport, he said. I made that decision, and then I looked at a screen for 2 seconds. I stayed in a relationship for 3 years past the point where I knew it wasn't right, she said. I was in that cafe with someone else's claim on me. I left the waiting room before you came out. I didn't ask for your last name. I didn't offer it. They looked at each other with the specific honesty of 2 people who've decided not to protect themselves from the full weight of the information available. We were both doing the best we could, she said finally, with what we had and who we were at each of those moments. The 25-year-old version of you who left that waiting room made the decision he was capable of making. That's generous. It's accurate. I'm a journalist. I try not to confuse the two. He almost smiled. Almost. And the almost was enough, was its own complete thing, had the specific quality of an almost that is more honest than the full version of the gesture it was approaching. They found a place for lunch at a small restaurant 2 blocks from the festival grounds, the kind of place that has been there long enough to stop trying to be anything other than what it is. Good food, plain tables, a woman in the kitchen who had been making the same dishes for 30 years, because they were the right dishes and there was no reason to change them. They talked for 3 hours. I will not try to transcribe 3 hours of conversation between two people who have 15 years of retroactive context and 33 years of individual lives and the specific energy of two minds that are well matched and know it. What I will tell you is the quality of it. It had the density of the best conversations, the ones in which each sentence opens into another and the time moves at the wrong speed, too fast on the outside and somehow expansive on the inside. A 3-hour conversation that felt like it had room for everything and still left things unsaid. They talked about their work, not the summaries of it, the actual texture, the questions it was trying to answer and the questions it kept generating. He told her about the Lisbon years, about what being foreign had taught him, about the specific education of working with buildings that were 4 times older than the country he came from, about how it had changed the way he understood materiality, the way a stone wall that has been standing for 200 years contains in its integrity a kind of argument, a proof of concept, a structural demonstration that something can endure. She told him about the book, about the peripheral neighborhoods, about what she had found in the edges of the city that the center obscured, the particular honesty of spaces that had not been designed for anyone's consumption, that were simply people living as they could with what they had. They talked about their families with more depth than the cafe in 2010, with the distance of a decade and a half producing the kind of perspective that makes it possible to talk about difficult things without being inside the difficulty. He talked about his father with more equanimity than he had at any point before, with the specific piece of someone who has worked through something without fully resolving it and has found that partial resolution is sufficient, that you do not need to fix everything in order to live well around it. She talked about her mother with the specific love of someone who has had years to appreciate what they were given, the hot chocolate, the yellow mug, the embrace that was everything. She told him about Mocha with the fullness she rarely allowed herself in professional contexts, because Mocha was private in a way Bogota was not, was the place she carried rather than the place she was identified with, and telling it to him felt. She would not examine this closely, not yet, like giving something to someone who would know how to hold it. He listened the way she had always remembered him listening, fully, without the performance of attention, actually receiving. You write about the margins of cities, he said, at some point in the second hour, because Moco is a margin. She looked at him. I've never said that to anyone, she said. You didn't have to say it. It's in the argument. The argument of the book? The argument of everything you've said today. She was quiet for a moment. My mother still lives there, she said. She's well now, she recovered. But I spent a year terrified that I had traded her for Bogota, that leaving had been a kind of taking without giving back, a pause. I still feel that sometimes. What do you do with it? I write about the margins, she half smiled. It's not a solution, but it's honest. Most of the things we do aren't solutions, he said. They're just honest. She looked at him. That's going to end up in something I write, she said. It's yours. The afternoon panel moved them back to the festival grounds. She was on a panel at 3. He was in the audience for hers. I want to tell you what it was like to watch him watch her on that panel. He sat in the 4th row, left of center, the position that gave the clearest sight line to the speakers without being directly in the speakers' primary field of vision, which was a choice that was either unconscious consideration for her or simply his habitual way of occupying a room, or both. He sat with his sketchbook open, as he always sat when he was listening seriously, because drawing while listening was the way he processed, the hand moving making space in the mind for the ear. She spoke for 18 minutes and then answered questions for 25, and she was, I need to say this plainly, extraordinary. Not in the performative sense, not with the rhetoric of someone who has learned to be impressive in front of a room, but in the precise sense of a person saying true things with complete clarity, of the work being so well thought through that the speaking of it required almost no effort, the effort having been done in the years of thinking and writing that preceded it. She talked about the informal city as the honest city. She talked about the language of improvisation as an architectural language. She talked about what the margins of a place have always known that the center pretends not to know. He drew the whole time. After the panel in the hallway outside the room, he showed her the drawing. It was not the room. It was not her. It was a building, small, improvised, the kind of structure you find in the periphery of a South American city. Built in stages, with the additions of different eras visible in different materials, each edition its own chapter in the story of the people who had lived there. It was beautiful in the way that honest things are beautiful. It was what he did when something moved him. He drew the architecture of the feeling rather than the feeling itself. She looked at it for a long time. "This is what I was trying to say," she said. "I know. That's why I drew it." They had dinner with a group from the festival, 5 other people, the kind of informal gathering that forms itself in the evening of a professional event when no one wants the day to be entirely over. They sat at a long table at a restaurant in the Laureles neighborhood, and the conversation was general and good, and they were both present in it, both contributing. And also, I observed this with the precision I bring to everything. Consistently, naturally, finding the angle of the conversation that returned them to each other the way 2 people in a room will, without apparent plan, keep ending up in the same part of it. By 10, the group had thinned to 3, and by 11 to 2. They were walking. Neither of them had suggested it. They had simply been the last 2 at the table and had both stood at the same moment and moved toward the door, and the door had opened onto the Medellin night, which was warm in the way Bogota's nights never quite managed. The warmth of a lower altitude, and the street was alive with the city's nighttime energy, and walking was the obvious response to all of it. They walked for 2 hours. Through Laureles and into El Poblado and along the paths above the city where, from certain angles, you could see the valley below with all its lights. Medellin spread out in every direction in that particular configuration of the city at night that looked as every city looked from. Above at night, like deliberate design, like someone had placed every light with intention, like the city was trying to communicate something to the sky. They talked about everything and they talked about nothing, which is the description of a conversation that is past the point where content is the point, where simply being in the exchange has become the purpose of the exchange. At some point on a path above the city, she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, which I don't think will be a problem for you." "It won't." All of the times we almost met, the airport, the cafe, the library, the waiting room, the neighborhood, do you think it was the circumstances that kept us from meeting? Or do you think it was us? He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she knew the quiet was real thinking, not stalling. "Both," he said. "The circumstances were real. The flight announcement was real. The boyfriend was real. The timing of the job was real." But he paused. Each of those circumstances was also a decision, or enabled a decision. I chose to leave the waiting room. You chose not to ask for a last name. I chose not to offer one. "We were both protecting something," she said. "Yes, at different moments, different things. But yes, what were you protecting?" He looked at her. The city's light was enough to see by, a diffuse glow from the valley below that was not quite illumination, but not quite darkness either, that particular in-between light of cities at a distance. "I think," he said slowly, "I was protecting the version of events in which I hadn't failed. In the waiting room, if I stayed and you came out and it was awkward or ordinary or nothing, that would have been a particular kind of disappointment. If I left, the possibility remained intact. You preserved the possibility by not testing it." "Yes, which is its own kind of cowardice. I know that." She considered. "I think I was protecting something different," she said. "I think I was protecting myself from wanting something I wasn't sure I was allowed to want. A name. A continuation. She stopped, then said the word clearly. "A chance. Why wouldn't you be allowed to want it? The boyfriend. The timing. She made a small gesture that meant all of it. The accumulated architecture of reasons. The general sense that the thing I wanted was not available in the form I wanted it. And now?" He said. The question landed between them with the full weight of its implications. She felt it land. He watched her feel it. "Now," she said, "I am standing on a hill above Medellin at midnight with a man I have been almost meeting for 15 years. And I'm 33, and I think I'm done protecting things that don't deserve protection." He looked at her. She looked at him. The city below them was doing what cities do at midnight, sustaining itself, moving through its own business, indifferent to the specific drama of two people standing above it. And the air was warm and slightly fragrant with something green. And the silence between them was not empty but full, was the kind of silence that contains a decision that neither person has made yet, but both are aware of approaching. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "I think about the waiting room. I have thought about it a lot. Not obsessively, not unhealthily, but as a reference point. As the conversation that set a standard I had trouble finding again." She was quiet. 41 minutes, she said. 41 minutes that felt like a different kind of time. The kind of time you're inside when something is real. "I know that kind of time. We're in it now." She looked at him. Not quickly. The full look, the one that didn't hurry, that received what was there. "We are," she said. And then she said, "Santiago, what aren't you telling me?" The pause before he answered was the longest pause of the night. I counted it. 4 seconds. Which is, in the context of a conversation between two people who have been honest with each other all evening, a very long pause. "I'm leaving for Lisbon in 2 days, he said. She looked at him. "A new project," he said. "A significant one. A complex in the Belling district, 18th century. The most important thing I'll have done. 18 months, maybe 2 years depending on, when did you know?" "I accepted 6 weeks ago. You've known for 6 weeks. "Yes." She turned away from him and looked at the city below. The lights, the valley, the particular arrangement of a place seen from above, which always looked more planned than it was, more deliberate, more as if someone had known what they were doing. "Of course," she said, not bitterly, with a quality that was something more complex than bitterness, more layered. The recognition of a pattern that had one more iteration in it, the pattern she had been thinking about all day, the geography of almost. "Valentina." "I know," she said. "I know it's not. I know. The project is real. The timing isn't something you constructed to. I wouldn't. I wouldn't. I know you wouldn't." They stood in silence for a moment, both looking at the city. "I could," she started. "Don't," he said gently. "Don't offer something because this is the first night, and the first night has a particular pressure to it. Don't offer what the night wants you to offer." She looked at him. "Is that what you think I was doing?" "I think you're honest," he said. "I think you're one of the most honest people I've ever talked to, and I also think that this night has been..." He paused, searching for the right word with the care he brought to words, which was the care of someone who had been living in his own silence long enough to know that words were precise tools and should be used precisely. Extraordinary. And extraordinary nights asked extraordinary things of people, and I don't want either of us to say something tonight that we say because of the night rather than because of us. She looked at him for a long time. "That," she said, "is the most careful thing anyone has ever said to me." "Is it the right kind of careful?" She thought about this honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. They walked back down toward the city at 1 a.m, slowly along the route that gave them the longest time in the warm night air before the hotels and the rooms and the separate mornings arrived. They talked less, not because the conversation had ended, but because it had reached a place where words were the less accurate instrument, where the walking itself was saying things that neither of them needed to translate. At the corner where their routes diverged, her hotel to the left, his to the right, they stopped. "I want your number," he said. She looked at him. "I have wanted your last name since 2007, she said. "Yes, you can have my number." She gave it to him. He gave her his. They both looked at the new contact in their phones with the specific quality of attention you give something that has taken a long time to arrive. "Write me," she said, "when I'm settled." "When I'm not still inside the departure," she looked at him. "Santiago." She said his name in a way that was complete in itself. That was not a preface to a question, but the question itself. "I know," he said. "I know what I'm asking you to hold. I know the ask is significant." "Then why aren't you?" "Because I'm afraid," he said, simply, without pretense. "I have been afraid of this specific thing for a long time, and the fear doesn't disappear just because the night has been what it's been." The fear is real and I'm acknowledging it instead of letting it make my decisions. That's the most I can offer right now. She looked at him with the full precision of her attention. That's more than most people offer, she said. Is it enough? A silence. Ask me again in 18 months, she said. It was not the answer he had hoped for and not the one he had feared. It was the honest answer, which was what he should have expected from her, and which he received with the equanimity of someone who has said an honest thing and has been met with an honest thing in return. 18 months, he said. Maybe 2 years, she said. Depending, he almost smiled. The almost again, the thing more honest than the full version. Good night, Valentina Ruiz. Good night, Santiago Mora. She turned left. He turned right. They walked in opposite directions into the middling night, which was warm and alive and entirely indifferent to what had just happened on the hill above it. She lay in her hotel room and did not sleep for a long time. She looked at the ceiling, not the ceiling of Moco, not the ceiling with the map she had memorized before she learned to read, but a hotel ceiling in Medellin, white and plain and without significance, and she looked at it the way she'd always looked at ceilings when something was happening in her that required processing. She thought about the night, about 15 years of near misses arriving at a hill above a city and then departing again in opposite directions. About the laugh in the airport that had no face for 7 years, and now had the most specific face she had ever seen. About the sketchbook turned without hesitation. About the notebook carried down 4 flights of stairs by hands that didn't know what they were carrying. About a doorway in the rain and the sound of gaps in a curtain of water, and a city that had kept putting them in the same places as if making an argument it couldn't quite finish. She thought about what he had said. I'm afraid. The fear is real and I'm acknowledging it instead of letting it make my decisions. She thought about her own fear, which she had not named so clearly in the night, but which was present. Had always been present, the fear of wanting something so specific and so long deferred that wanting it had become its own kind of exposure. She opened her notebook, the 10th iteration. She wrote 3 sentences and stopped. She looked at what she had written and we have been in the same places for 15 years. Tonight we were in the same place at the same time, and we still couldn't quite arrive. I don't know if that's a story ending or beginning. She looked at the sentence. She did not cross it out. He lay in his hotel room and looked at the ceiling and thought about the hill above the city and the look she had given him when he said he was afraid. Not the look of disappointment, which he had braced for. Not the look of someone who had waited long enough and had found the waiting was not going to be rewarded tonight, which he had also braced for. The look of someone who recognized the thing he had named, who had the same thing in herself and had been living with it, managing it, making decisions around it for years. The look of someone for whom the fear was not a reason to stop, but a thing to be acknowledged and then move through. He thought about the sketchbook in his bag. The personal one, the one that was not for the Lisbon project or the firm's work, but for the buildings without function. The structures that had to justify themselves through form alone. He got up. He sat at the small desk in the hotel room and opened the sketchbook and drew for an hour. He drew the hill above Medellin, not as landscape but as structure, the retaining walls, the paths, the way the city below was visible from that specific angle. He drew the long library table on the 3rd floor with the north window and the light from the left and both sides of the table occupied simultaneously, which was the version that had never existed in real life, but existed now in the drawing, which was perhaps the closest thing available to truth. He drew the waiting room on the 12th floor with 2 people and a stack of forma issues and a window with a view of the mountains and the specific quality of a conversation that knew it was better than the space it was being held in. He drew the doorway in the rain. Then he drew not a building, not a structure, nothing with walls or windows or the geometry of habitable space, just 2 lines converging. He looked at the drawing. 2 lines converging, still converging, not yet arrived. He closed the sketchbook. He sat in the hotel room in Medellin and felt the particular weight of a decision that had been made and that was right, and that was also simultaneously the most expensive right decision he had ever made. Lisbon was the right decision. He was also aware with a clarity that he did not try to argue with, that he was leaving something that had taken 15 years to arrive at, and that might not be there in the same form when he came back, and that this was the cost, and that the cost was real, and that paying it anyway was either wisdom or cowardice or both, and that he would not know which until he was far enough from this night to see the whole. He was 33. He was afraid. He was going anyway. She did not write first. He did not write first. A week passed, and then 2, and then a month, and neither of them opened the contact they had added to their phones on a warm October night in Medellin and typed the first word, which was not a long word or a complicated word. It was simply the first word, and neither of them typed it. I watched with the patience I have always had, which is not the patience of someone who has accepted the outcome, but the patience of someone who knows that some things require the exact right moment, and that the exact right moment has not yet arrived, and that waiting for it is the only available option. They both had reasons. His were practical and also not. The departure, the project, the settlement in a new city that demanded total attention. The sense that writing from inside the chaos of beginning would be writing from the wrong state, would be the night talking rather than him, and he had promised himself he would not do that. Hers were also practical and also not. The return to Bogota, the work that had accumulated in her absence, the piece she was writing about the festival that required a professional distance from her own experience of it. And underneath those reasons, deeper and less examined, the fear, the real one, the one she had named honestly in the night and then protected herself from with the practical reasons, which were real but were also protection. She was afraid to write first, because writing first was the declaration, was the thing that made the hoping into the wanting, and she had learned at considerable cost the difference between those two states. He was afraid to write first because writing first was the admission, was the thing that made the departure into the leaving someone, which was a different and heavier thing, and he was not sure he was strong enough to carry that in Lisbon simultaneously, so neither of them wrote. The days accumulated. The distance between Bogota and Lisbon is 9,000 kilometers and 8 time zones and the Atlantic Ocean. And all of those things are real and can be named, and none of them is the actual distance, which was the thing neither of them had yet been brave enough to cross. I watched the phone that sat on her desk in the east-facing apartment with the morning light. The contact opened some mornings and then closed. I watched the phone that sat on his desk in a Lisbon apartment he was learning to inhabit. The contact opened some evenings and then closed. I watched. I held what I always hold. The weight of everything that is still possible and has not yet become real. The distance between those two things, possible and real, is the same distance it has always been. It is the size of a first word. It is the size of a decision made not by impulse but by choice. It is, as it has always been, exactly the size of what they have not yet said. Not yet. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. The Right Moment. 2023, 34 years old, there is a particular weight to knowing. I've carried it since the beginning, since a waiting area in El Dorado in January of 2007, when a girl with a green suitcase sat down with Garcia Marquez on her knees and a boy across the room, laughed at something his friend said, and the laugh traveled 14 meters through airport air and landed on her without a face, without a name, without anything that could be traced back to its source. I knew then. I have known through every airport and every rain and every library and every waiting room, through every almost and every not yet and every almost but not quite yet. I've carried the weight of knowing in the specific way of someone who cannot act on the knowledge, who can only watch and witness and hold, the way a wall holds weight, not by moving it but by refusing to let it fall. This is the last chapter. I want you to understand what that means for me before I tell you what it means for them. It means I am almost free. 5 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days passed between the night on the hill above Medellin and the morning she wrote the first word. She had not counted them as they accumulated. She was not the kind of person who counted days. That was her narrator's habit, not hers. She had simply been living her life with a particular quality of someone who is aware of an open window in one of the rooms, a window that lets in a specific quality of air, and has been managing around it without closing it or going through it, maintaining the equilibrium of a person who's not ready and knows it and is waiting to be ready without knowing when that will be. She wrote, she worked. She edited 2 issues of Forma that she was proud of, a piece about urban memory in Cartagena and a photo essay about informal housing in Cali that she had championed for 3 months, against the opinion of 2 colleagues who thought it was too raw and who were wrong. She went to Moco in February for her mother's birthday and spent 4 days in the small house with the orange tree that was now taller than the roof, taller than anything in the garden, a tree that had become enormous while no one was specifically watching, which was something she wrote about in the notebook without examining why it felt so personal. She ran on Sunday mornings in the park nearest her apartment, the one that had a hill steep enough to make it worth the effort. She saw friends, had dinners, read 12 books in 5 months, 4 of which she would never forget. She did not write to Santiago Mora. The contact sat in her phone with the quality of something both very present and very still, a door she passed many times without opening. She opened it occasionally, not to write, but simply to look at the name, which was an act she recognized as private and not entirely rational and did not judge herself for. She was 33 years old. She had been a journalist for a decade. She understood the difference between the impulse to act and the readiness to act, and she was applying that understanding to herself with the precision she applied to everything, except, she admitted in the notebook, this. The notebook knew more than she said out loud. The notebook had known for 3 months. The piece she was working on in March was about architectural memory, specifically, about the question of whether a building could be said to remember. Whether the concept of memory applied to inanimate structures in any way that was more than metaphor. It was a piece she'd been developing since Medellin, since the exhibition and the panel and the conversation that had lasted all day and half the night, since standing in front of a photograph of a 19th century industrial building that was in the process of becoming something new without forgetting what it had been. She had been researching. She had read 6 architectural theory texts, interviewed 3 architects in Bogota, and gathered material for 2 months. The piece was good. She could feel it being good in a specific way she could always feel it. The way a structure feels sound when the load is distributed correctly, when nothing is being asked to carry more than it was built for. She was writing the 3rd section on a Tuesday morning in March, seated at the desk by the east window, when she wrote a sentence that stopped her. The building that knows what it was is more honest than the building that pretends it was what it is now. It carries its own history in its materials, in the compression of its stones, in the oxidation of its metal joints, and this carrying is not a burden but an argument. I have been used, and I'm still standing. She looked at the sentence. She had not thought about him when she wrote it, or she had not decided to think about him, but the sentence was his. It was built from what he had said, in Lisbon and in Medellin and in the cafe in 2010. The accumulated material of what he believed about buildings and about time and about the things that endure precisely because they acknowledge what they have been. She had been writing about him for 5 months without sending it. She sat with this realization for a full minute. Then she opened her phone. The contact was there, as it had always been, Santiago Mora, the number she had added on a warm October night with the quality of someone adding something long overdue. The number she had not dialed or texted in 5 months and 3 weeks, and she did the small arithmetic now, finally, 4 days. She typed one sentence. I've been writing about you for 5 months without sending it. This is me sending it. She read it once. She pressed send before she could protect herself from it. His response came 3 hours later, which was the middle of the afternoon in Lisbon, which was where it was the middle of the afternoon when the message arrived. He was in the building, the Berlin complex, 19th century textile factory, in the 3rd month of its transformation, when his phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. He was standing in what had been the main production hall and was going to be, when the work was done, a shared cultural space with a capacity for concerts, exhibitions, and the kind of indoor public gathering that this corner of Lisbon had been missing. The walls were exposed stone and brick, 800 square meters of them, 3 stories high, and he'd been standing in the middle of them for 20 minutes because he did this sometimes. Stood in the buildings he was working on and simply inhabited them. Let them tell him what they needed. which was a practice his team had learned to recognize as productive rather than idle, as the work that preceded the visible work. He felt the vibration, took out the phone. Read the message. He stood still for longer than 20 minutes. He had been drafting a message for 4 months. Not drafting literally, he had not written and deleted, had not accumulation of discarded attempts. He had been drafting in his head, in the way that architects draft in their heads before they put anything on paper, running the logic, testing the load, making sure the structure was sound before committing it to a form that would have to support itself. He had not found the form yet. He had not found the form because the honest form of what he wanted to say was something that required more courage than he had been able to generate at a sufficient distance from October, from the hill, from her face in the diffuse light of a city seen from above. He looked at her message. "I've been writing about you for 5 months without sending it. This is me sending it." He typed, "I've been drafting this reply for 4 months. Here it is. I'm glad you sent it." He read it, added one line. "Also, what have you been writing?" He sent it. He put the phone in his pocket and looked at the walls around him, 800 square meters of stone and brick that had been standing for 250 years. That had absorbed the labor of hundreds of workers in the 19th century, and the indifference of abandonment in the 20th, and were now absorbing the work of being made into something new. Walls that knew what they were, walls that were still standing. He went back to work, but something in the quality of the afternoon had changed, the way a room changes when a window is opened slightly. Same room, different air. What came after was not a love story in the epistolary sense, not the dramatic correspondence of two people separated by an ocean and consumed by the writing of it. It was quieter than that and stranger than that. It was two people who had found each other's frequency after 15 years of almost finding it and were now simply using it, carefully, honestly, without the performance of romantic correspondence, without the pressure of making each message earn its weight. They wrote about their work, which was where they were both most themselves. He sent her photographs of the Bellin complex in progress, the walls at different times of day, the way the light changed the argument the stone made about itself, the steel and glass insertions going in one structural element at a time, each one a decision negotiated between the new and the old. She sent him sections of the architectural memory piece as she finished them, which was not something she did with her work before publication, not as a rule. She was protective of work in progress, kept it close until it was finished, but she sent these to him because they were partly his and he deserved to see them becoming what they were. He read everything she sent with the focused attention that was his particular form of respect. He responded with specificity, not with praise, which she would have discounted, but with questions, with the places where he pushed back, with the moments where he said, "This is the best sentence in the piece," and named exactly which sentence it was and why. And his why was always architecturally precise in a way that made her understand her own work differently. She did the same for his. He sent her plans and sketches and, occasionally, the written descriptions he prepared for client presentations, which were a form of prose she found remarkable, technical and specific, and yet suffused with a quality of care. That was evident in every choice of word, every sentence that explained not just what a space would be, but why it would be good to be in it. They discovered that they had been reading the same book, a Colombian urban theorist whose latest work had been published in February, and that both of them had bought independently and were annotating in parallel. Their marginalia a private conversation they hadn't known they were having. They talked about their families, more fully than before, with the additional depth that distance and time and the particular intimacy of text can create, the kind of conversation that is easier in writing because the writer has time to find the true thing before the words leave them. He wrote about his father with a clarity that surprised him, the specific resolution of someone who has been to a place far enough away to understand the place he came from, not forgiven. Exactly, not the theatrical absolution of the adult child, but something more durable than that, a comprehension that did not require the hurt to be erased in order to be survived. She wrote about Mocha with the fullness she had never given it in print, the orange tree, the map on the ceiling, the rooster, the green suitcase, the hot chocolate and the cassava bread at 5 in the morning of a day that changed everything. He wrote back, "The green suitcase? I saw it from across a waiting room when I was 18 and I didn't know what I was looking at." She read that sentence 3 times. Wrote back, "You were supposed to come over and ask." He wrote, "I was 18. I was afraid of the girl who was reading Garcia Marquez, like it was the only thing happening in the airport." She wrote, "That was exactly what it was." She went to Lisbon in June. The professional reason was real. Forma wanted a feature on adaptive reuse projects in Europe, and there were 3 worth writing about, and one of them was his, which she had recused herself from editing and which a colleague would write while she wrote the broader piece. She was going for 10 days. She had a list of buildings and meetings and a hotel in the Same Neighbourhood. She told Claudia Reyes the professional reason. She told her mother the same thing. She told herself the same thing, with the addendum that the professional reason was also a personal one, and that the personal reason was also a professional one, and that the distinction between the two had stopped being legible in March, and she had stopped requiring herself to maintain it. She told Santiago she was coming 3 weeks before the trip. His response was one line, "I'll meet you at the airport." She wrote back, "You don't have to." He wrote, "I know." She did not write back to that because there was nothing to say to it that was more accurate than its own economy. The flight from Bogotá to Lisbon with the connection in Madrid was 17 hours and 40 minutes, and she slept through most of it and spent the hours she was awake looking out at the Atlantic from above, which was an experience she had not had before, and which was exactly what she expected. Enormous, honest, the ocean below refusing to be anything other than what it was, and also not what she expected, which was the specific quality of looking at a vast thing and finding it calming rather than overwhelming, as if the scale of the water made the scale of what she was flying toward feel manageable by comparison. She landed at Lisbon's Humberto Delgado Airport on a Tuesday morning in June at 8:55, went through passport control, collected her bag, walked through the sliding doors into arrivals. He was standing at the barrier, not holding a sign, not holding anything, just standing with the quality of someone who has been waiting long enough to have arrived at a state of genuine patience, not the performance of patience, not the slightly too casual stance of someone hiding their nervousness, but the real thing, the stillness of a person who is comfortable in the act of waiting because they have always been comfortable. In the act of waiting, have in fact been doing it in one form or another for 16 years. He saw her. She saw him, and this time, finally, for the first time since a waiting area in El Dorado in 2007, they were in the same place at the same time, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was about to turn away. She walked toward him. He walked toward her. The distance closed. There was no dramatic pause at the end of it, no cinema beat of suspension before the thing happened. She arrived at the barrier and he was there, and they looked at each other in the specific way of 2 people who've been corresponding across an ocean for 3 months and are now resolving the correspondence into a physical fact. And the physical fact was smaller than the distance between them had made it feel and larger than a single room could contain. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. She hugged him. She did this before he could calculate it, before either of them could make it into a decision. Which was the right way to do it, and which was, she would tell him later, the most journalistic thing she had done in years, arriving at the fact directly, without the preamble. He hugged her back with both arms, which was the only honest response to the situation. And for a moment that neither of them counted, they stood at the arrivals barrier of a Portuguese airport with 17 hours of flight between them and 16 years of everything else. And the weight of both of those things was present, and so was something lighter than both of them, something that was neither the journey nor the arrival, but the specific quality of being where you are supposed to be. "You look tired," he said, when they separated. "I slept on a plane for 11 hours, she said. "I look like someone who slept on a plane for 11 hours. "You look like that," he agreed. "And also like yourself." She looked at him. "That's a strange compliment." "It's not a compliment," he said. "It's an observation. You look exactly like yourself." She understood what he meant, and it was better than any compliment. Lisbon received her the way cities receive people who are arriving at the right time, with a quality of openness, of available space, of light that comes from a particular angle and finds particular surfaces in a particular way. The city performing itself for someone who is prepared to see it. She had been to European cities before, Madrid twice, Barcelona once, Buenos Aires, which was its own category. But Lisbon had a quality she had not encountered, a compactness and a height in a relationship between its hills and its water that reminded her in certain oblique ways of Moco, of the place she carried rather than the place she inhabited, the place where the mountains came down to meet something else, and the something else was not a river but the sea. He showed her the city, not as a tourist guide. He was constitutionally unsuited to that, too interested in the specific rather than the comprehensive, but as someone showing a person something they love, with the focused selection of the lover who knows the thing well enough to choose what to show first and what to leave for later and what to trust the city to reveal on its own terms. He took her to the Alfama in the early morning, when the streets were still cool and the Fado was only a promise in the closed windows of the restaurants that wouldn't open for hours, and she understood immediately why someone had decided that the music of this particular steep neighborhood and the music of longing were the same music. He took her to a bakery, pasties, donata and espresso, the coffee the right kind, the pastry the right temperature, the light through the bakery's glass front exactly correct, and she ate in the contented silence of someone receiving something good without analysis. He took her to a Miraduro above the city where the view extended to the Tagus and the bridge and the south bank and the specific geometry of a city built on 7 hills that from above described something that looked like intention, like a plan, like someone had known what they were building. She stood at the Miraduro rail and looked at the city and felt the particular feeling she had only had in a few places in her life, the feeling of a space that was asking a question she recognized. What's the question? He asked, because he had been watching her face and had apparently learned, in the 16 years and the 3 months and the 17 hours of flight that constituted the distance between them, how to read it. How do people know to build here? She said. The first people, before the plan was visible. How did they know this was the right place? They didn't know, he said. They chose. And then they stayed. And then the choice became the place. She looked at him. That's going in the piece, she said. It's yours. He took her to the building on the 3rd day. She had seen the photographs. She had seen the plans. She had read his descriptions, which were precise and careful, and which she had understood, as she understood most of what he wrote, in the space slightly above the literal meaning. She had thought she knew what she was going to see. She didn't know. The Bellum complex was... She stood in the entrance of the main hall and simply stopped. In the involuntary way she stopped when confronted with something that required full attention, not beautiful in the way. Beautiful things usually are beautiful, not polished or resolved or complete in the sense of leaving nothing to do. It was beautiful in the way that honesty is beautiful. It showed everything, hid nothing, made no argument it couldn't support with its own materials. The 19th century walls were what they were. 250 years of stone and brick, compressed and solid, carrying the compression in the way old walls carry it, visibly without apology, the structural reality legible in the surface. And against those walls, into those walls, through those walls, the new insertions of steel and glass, the structural surgery that had opened the building to light it had never had, that had connected spaces that had been separate, that had converted the hierarchy of the old industrial program, the division of production into categories of labor and material, into a democratic openness in which every level of the building was visible from every other, in which nothing was hidden from itself. The building knew what it had been. It was becoming what it needed to be. The conversation between those two things was visible in every joint, every interface, every place where the old stone met the new glass, and the two materials looked at each other with the honesty of a good translation, not erasure, not imposition, but the specific labor of two languages finding the space between them where they could speak. She stood in the main hall for a long time. He stood beside her and said nothing, because he understood she had always understood, since the sketchbook in the cafe and the argument in the waiting room when silence was the right response, and when it was evasion, And this silence was the right response, was the silence of two people inside something that was worth being quiet for. How long did it take you to understand the building? She asked finally. 4 months, he said. The first 4 months I was working against it, trying to make it something it didn't want to be. And then one morning I came in and stood here. He indicated the center of the hall, exactly where they were standing, and just listened. And it told me, what did it tell you? That it had been standing for 250 years because it was honest. Because the people who built it didn't try to make it something else. They built for what they needed and they built it true. And that truth is why it's still here. A pause. And then I understood that my job wasn't to contradict that. It was to continue it. To be as honest in the new language as they had been in the original. She looked at the walls. At the stone that had been standing since before Columbia existed as a republic. At the light coming through the new glass insertions at an angle that the original builders had never intended, and that was somehow the most faithful thing in the room. The light finding the surfaces the stone had been hiding for centuries, and making them finally visible. You build spaces where people can be well, she said. He turned and looked at her. That's what you said you wanted. When you were a child, you told me in the waiting room in 2014, you said you wanted to build spaces where people could be well. Spaces that didn't lie. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had first seen on a hill above Medellin and had been carrying in her memory since October. The expression that contained too many things simultaneously, that was too complex to be named by any single emotion. You've been carrying that for 9 years, he said. I remember things that are true, she said simply. It's a professional habit. She paused. Also a personal one. He was quiet. He stopped, started again. Nobody has ever said that back to me. Something I said about myself. 9 years later, someone should have. He looked at the walls. At the light. At the building that knew what it had been and was still standing. I'm going to tell you something, he said, and his voice had the quality it had when he was being precise about something important, not carefully managed, just accurate, the way a structural calculation is accurate. I have been afraid of the specific version of my own life in which I find what I actually want and then fail to keep it, in which I arrive somewhere, make the wrong decision, and lose it. That fear is what left the waiting room in 2014. That fear is what didn't write first in November. I know, she said. You do? You told me, on the hill. You said you preserved the possibility by not testing it. You said it was cowardice. It was. It was also the best you could do at that moment, she said. And I told you that. I still believe it. What about now? He said. The question had the same weight it had had on the hill in October, the same full significance of those two words in that configuration. What about now? But it was different now because now they were inside a building that had been standing for 250 years, having the conversation between its old self and its new self, and the building was the argument. The building was the proof that old and new could speak honestly to each other, that the passage of time was not an obstacle to the thing being true, but simply the material the thing was made of. Now, she said, I'm standing inside the most honest building I've ever been in, with the person who made it honest, and I'm gonna tell you something I've been not saying for approximately 9 months, which is long enough. He looked at her. I've been writing about you since October, she said. Not the architectural memory piece, the other writing. The writing that is not for anything. The writing I do to see if it's true. And it has been about you since October, and I kept writing it and kept not sending it. And then I sent a message in March and you said you were glad I sent it. And I've been in the city for 3 days, and every single thing I've seen, I've wanted to tell you about, even when you were standing next to me while I was seeing it, and I was already telling you in real time. She stopped. I don't know what to call that. But I know it's real, and I know it has been real since a cafe on a rainy Thursday in 2010, and I'm done protecting myself from the honest name of it. He looked at her. Outside, through the new glass insertions and the old stone walls, the June light was doing what Santiago had designed it to do, finding the surfaces, making the invisible visible, rendering the argument in the only language that architecture ultimately speaks, the language of presence, of being here, of the specific and irreplaceable quality of this light on this stone at this hour of this day. He crossed the distance between them, not quickly, not with the urgency of someone who has been waiting too long and is correcting a mistake, but with the intention of someone who has decided finally and completely, with all the information available, with full knowledge of the cost and the value and the specific weight of every year that had preceded this moment. And when he reached her, he put his hands on either side of her face in the specific way of someone who wants to see clearly what they are doing, who wants no ambiguity in the gesture, and he looked at her for one complete second in which everything that had happened since January of 2007 was present simultaneously. The airport, the rain, the library, the cafe, the waiting room, the doorway, the hill, the 5 months of silence, and the 3 months of correspondence, and the 17 hours of flight. And then he kissed her. Not the first kiss of strangers. The first kiss of two people who have known each other for a very long time and are finally in the same place at the same time, with nothing separating them from the honest name of what they are to each other. The building held them, as it had been holding things for 250 years, as it intended to go on holding things for 250 more, with the patient integrity of a structure that was built true and has never had any reason to become anything else. That evening they walked along the Tagus. The Belém waterfront at dusk has a quality of light that I know because I have been here for all of it. All the days of this building's existence. All the water that has moved past this bank. All the departures from the specific geography. The ships that left from the tower down the road in the 16th century, carrying people who did not know what was on the other side of the ocean and went anyway because the not knowing was not a reason not to go. They walked slowly, the way they had walked in Medellin 9 months ago, with the unhurried quality of two people who have stopped treating time as a problem to be managed and are simply inside it. They talked about going back to Bogota. Not urgently, not with the pressure of a decision that needed to be made that night, but with the openness of people arranging a future they have decided to share, discussing the details the way you discuss the details of a building you have agreed to build together, not the grand vision, which is already agreed, but the practical particulars, the how and the when, the load-bearing elements. The project in Belém would run through December, possibly into January. She would come back in October. There was a conference in Porto she'd been asked to speak at, and again in December. He would come to Bogota in September for a week for the Trema firm's annual review, which Isabella had been managing in his absence with her characteristic competence, and which he needed to be present for in person. They talked about the apartment she was in, the one with the east-facing window in Chapinero, the view of the mountains, and about the apartment he would find when he returned, which she said would need a north-facing window and good bones, and which he said would need to be close to a bakery that made the right kind of coffee. "I know a bakery," she said. "The one on your block, Gonzalo's. He mentioned you once. He said you came on Mondays and drew in a notebook while you drank your coffee." He looked at her. "I was 3 blocks away for 11 months, he said. "I moved in after he'd been there 6 months. We were both there for 5 months. And we stood in a doorway in the rain for 10 minutes, she said. And he told me to listen for the gaps. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't know it was you." "I didn't know it was you either." The Tagus moved past them, dark and steady. The Abril Bridge lit in the distance with its specific red. The lights of the south bank reflected in the water with that distorted, elongated quality that water gives to light, making it longer, softer, more uncertain in its edges, the way memory makes things. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask, do you think we wasted them? The years." She considered this for a long time. "The water, the bridge, the lights." "No," she said. "I think we were the people we needed to be at each of those moments. The 18-year-old who heard a laugh without a face needed to hear it without a face. The 21-year-old who sat at opposite ends of a table needed the distance." She paused. "And the 33-year-old on the hill needed to say, 'Ask me in 18 months,' because she wasn't ready yet to say yes with her whole self, and she had spent enough of her life saying things with half of herself." He looked at her, Are you ready now? I'm in Lisbon, she said. I crossed an ocean. That's the most ready I know how to be. He took her hand. She looked down at their hands and then up at his face, and then at the river, and the river did not care about any of it, which was correct, which was how it should be. The indifference of large things is not hostility, but simply the accurate scale of the world, and the accurate scale of the world is what makes the small things matter. They walked until the city told them it was time to stop, and then they stopped. And they stood above the water, and the water went past, and the city went on, and the light held everything it could hold. She called her mother from the hotel that night. It was late in Bogota, but her mother picked up on the second ring. Because Gloria Ruiz had never needed much sleep, and because she had been waiting for this call in the way she had always waited for. Valentina's important calls, not anxiously, but with the specific attentiveness of someone who has been paying attention for 34 years and knows when a call is ordinary and when it is not. Mom, how's Lisbon? She looked for the word. It's honest. A pause. Gloria understood the word. She had raised a daughter who used language precisely, and she had learned over the years to receive the precision as the love it was. And the architect? Gloria said. Not the project. The architect. How do you know about him? You mentioned him. In October. You said you'd almost met him before. Somewhere else. I said it once. In passing. You said it the way you say the important things, Gloria said. Quietly. Valentina looked at the ceiling of the Lisbon hotel room. Not her ceiling. Not the one with the map she had memorized before she learned to read. But another ceiling in another country. And it was enough. He's good, Mom. She stopped. Started again. He builds spaces where people can be well. That's what he does. A silence from Bogota, warm and complete. That sounds like someone worth knowing, Gloria said. It is. How long have you known him? Valentina thought about the airport, the waiting area, the green suitcase and the laugh without a face, and the first edition of Garcia, Marquez and the map made of cracks on a ceiling in Moco. 16 years, she said, more or less. Gloria laughed, a full, delighted, entirely unsurprised laugh, the laugh of a woman who had been alive long enough to know that the important things always took longer than anyone wanted them to and arrived exactly when they were supposed to. Then it was worth the wait, she said. Valentina smiled. It really was. She left Lisbon on a Sunday morning in late June with 10 days of notes, 3 rolls of photographs, the outline of the best piece she had written in 2 years, and his jacket. The jacket was a mistake that was not a mistake. She had worn it the previous evening when the Lisbon night had turned cold on the waterfront, and in the morning they had both noticed it was still over the chair by the door, and he had said, take it, and she had said, you'll need it. And he had said, I have 3 months left here, and Bogota is colder than Lisbon, and she had looked at him and taken the jacket, and they had both understood this was not about the jacket. He drove her to the airport. At the departures door, with the taxi lane full and the airport beginning its Sunday morning activity, they stood on the pavement and looked at each other in the specific way of people who are not saying goodbye, but see you soon. And the difference between those two states is enormous, and they both knew it. September, he said. September, she confirmed. I'll find the apartment when I'm back. North-facing window. Good bones. Close to Gonzalo's, she said. Close to Gonzalo's. She kissed him once, briefly on the pavement outside Humberto Delgado departures, with the taxis going past, and the morning commencing, and the specific irrelevance of airports to anything that actually matters. Then she went in. At the first turn in the departures hall, she looked back. He was still there, which she had not expected and which she had expected completely, both at the same time. She raised her hand. He raised his. She turned the corner. And now I need to tell you something I have never told anyone, because I have never been asked, and because I have never had a reason to say it until now. I was in that airport in January of 2007. I have been in every airport, every library, every cafe, every waiting room. I have been in Moco and in Bogota and Cartagena and in Medellin and in Lisbon. I've been 3 blocks away and 12 meters away and 10 feet away and a doorway wide and a page turn apart. I have been in every space these two people have shared without knowing they shared it, and I have carried the weight of every moment in which the thing that could have happened did not happen. I am the witness. That is what I am. I am the one who knows the whole story because I was present for all of it. Who carries the parts that the people inside the story cannot carry because they were only there for their own chapter and I was there for every chapter. Who holds the airport in the rain and the library and the notebook and the waiting room and the rain again and the hill above Medellin all at once. The whole accumulation of it, 16 years of almost and near and not yet. I have been asked in this telling whether I believe in fate. I believe in structure. I believe that things have a logic that is not always visible until you are far enough back to see the whole. I've been far enough back to see the whole since the beginning, and what I have seen is this: two people with the same quality of attention, the same fundamental honesty, the same way of being in the world, which is indifferent and enormous and does not care about any individual story, putting them in the same places over and over again. The world did not do that for them. The world does not do things for anyone. But I noticed, and I held it, and I waited. That is the only kind of fate I know, the act of witnessing a thing long enough for it to become real. The patience of staying with a story through every chapter, through every near miss and every almost and every not yet until the not yet becomes now. In the El Dorado waiting area in January of 2007, a girl of 18 sat down with a green suitcase and a copy of 100 Years of Solitude and settled into the specific concentrated stillness of a serious reader. On the other side of the room, also 18, a boy was drawing a building with no function on the last page of a sketchbook. He looked up. He saw her. He didn't know what he was looking at. I knew. I knew then what I know now, that the most important things in a life are usually not recognized in the moment of their arrival, that they come in without announcement, sit quietly in the corner, wait to be seen, that the distance between a thing arriving and a person being ready to receive it is not a failure but a measure of growth, of time, of the particular human work of becoming ready for what you want. I have been carrying the weight of what almost happened for 16 years. In a building in Belém, in June, in the light of a Portuguese morning, coming through 19th century stone, something stopped almost happening and simply happened. And I am lighter now than I have ever been. The way I sat down is not grief. It was never grief. It was hope. And hope, when it finally becomes real, doesn't disappear. It just changes its name. End of chapter 6.